First of all, I want to say the panel went like relatively like great. It wasn't as blood sporty as like I thought it was going to be, but otherwise like things didn't completely go to hell like people predicted. And I want to say to all the conservatives out there who always complain about leftists, all the minorities, like most of the minorities in like Prime's like platform, we all wanted this to happen, right? We all said it could be like really productive and like there's some good things that could come out of it. So like when like a lot of times there are a lot of conservatives that come on here and say we don't want to talk or we like want to stop speech from happening or stop things from happening. That's not true. Yeah, that's it.
Rage.
I liked the panel. It was interesting to hear a lot of the different perspectives, and a lot of the stuff I already could. I already knew some of people's positions because I've heard things here and there. It would have been cool if you got some people for the panel who were more, I don't know what to say, rambunctious. Even though I know that there was already a controversy with this panel already, but it might have been more interesting to have more divergence in the opinions that were shared.
Is the Johnny? Does she go by she her Johnny?
She they.
Yeah.
Is she a conservative or?
No, she's left.
Okay, that's literally just my southern accent bias. I was just curious because I know that I think she was in the room and then she dropped out.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, there was a lot of churn behind the scenes. Yeah, but I'm glad we had the group that we did. I think it was quite successful. But these takes were all the takes that were given, right? Especially from the people who were minorities here on this panel. Like, what do you think about the takes on whiteness and what that was? Did you agree with what was said there or disagree? My thoughts.
Not all of it. I brought it up before while we were sitting in here that I think the idea that white people don't have anything to be proud of is not true. There's plenty of things in America that are like come from white heritage that like people are proud of and they actively celebrate yearly, right? Like if it whether it comes from like European cultures or it's a mix like Cajun culture in Louisiana and things like that. Those things exist and those things are things people are proud of. Like, and those aren't like things that like we actively say that you shouldn't be proud of. At least, well, normal people. I know that we talk about how some people try to relate those things to other stolen cultures and try to demonize those things. But relatively, like in like the normal world, these things like have value. These things are things that people are proud of. That's the only thing I really have an issue with.
So I was going to change. I see your hand up, Quill, and then Wordy. I was going to change the title to "Is White Pride Okay?" And Twitch would not let me do that. Twitch bans you from making certain titles, and I cannot put up.
How about that, huh?
If you can put Black Pride.
Try any other racial or ethnic group.
I'm going to do it now. Yeah. All right. Let's do it. Like,
Wait, that's banned in chat as well. I heard someone messaging that they weren't able to put those two words in the same message, white and pride.
Like it is Black Pride. Like, Black Pride works.
That's going to get clipped, sent to one of the conservatives. They're going to come in the panel and be like, well, remember this clip when...
Okay, all right. Well, it's interesting.
Redneck impression.
And I do actually want to explore this idea of white pride, like the that Chris brought up, right? And what exactly that means, what it means to other people, right? Other minorities here. So we got more voices here now. I want to explore what that means. So let's go to Quill. Go ahead.
I mean, like, are you just asking for what you think the words white pride means?
You want to know what does white pride mean to you?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, typically when you hear something like white pride, based on the history behind it, you might assume, like I might assume that it's inherently negative, just based on white power, white pride. Those are terms that were typically used by white supremacists and racists historically. But I mean, like if somebody says white pride, I'm proud to be white, and you might be like, well, what do you mean by that? Instead of I'm proud to be Latino or I'm proud to be black, you may not bat an eye. And I feel like white pride doesn't always necessarily mean necessarily like inherently negative, but I feel like a lot of people who use it do have inherently, like not inherently negative, but a lot of people who may say it have those thoughts, and not a lot of people use it positively, or not outwardly, at least.
Wordy, then Salsa.
Yeah, so like when you have to look in the entire history, right? You got to run down the line. It's like gotta see where things are connected. Like we were talking about earlier, Chris, is like the whole lederhosen shit. Like you have a clear drawback to where that stems from Germany, right? But when you look at like Black history, and at a certain point, it's just like it's kind of like explodes at one point where like tons of people just got taken, and there's no real way to connect it. And the problem comes is like you look at the whole history of like evocation of white pride. It specifically is in reaction to like these movements that were developing to overcome these issues, right? Like the whole white power movement started like particularly recently. I learned is like the whole like significantly developed after the Vietnam War, when a lot of like races kind of like went into Vietnam, and they kind of got radicalized into the far right movement because they were in the process of that warfare. And so specifically is you have to look at the context in which movements forms, and like the whole white pride shit, it's like specifically forming from that distinction itself.
Let's go to Salsa.
Yeah, so I was gonna mention that, like going back on what Chris said when he said like the German, but I believe Wordy like stole a lot of the things I was gonna say.
You're
It's
welcome.
more or less
I can read your mind.
Yeah, right. I think there's just more or less a difference, right? Because like whenever it's rarely like Latino pride, but it's often like Puerto Rican Day Festival, Puerto Rican Pride, Mexican Pride, Cuban Pride. It's like specific to these nationalities and that cultures, and you bring those in, and those are where the parades and those are the events, so those are the festivals. But when you have like white pride or whatever, it's oftentimes not in that same like it is a response oftentimes, right? Like I would say like if you were to do like some American type of pride, right? Or you could do like the Cajuns, just happen to be like a lot of white people there, right? Or like monster truck fucking rallies or shows, or I don't know. It's like I think there's a little bit of a difference in the way that it's communicated out into to the rest of the nation as opposed to all the other nationalities when they're doing
I think it's a very basic, easy talking point, right, for the alt-right, is to use that like, hey, we don't have white pride in this country. We don't have white pride here, right? I mean, they have black pride, like you hear that all the time, but we don't have white pride. And so what we're doing here is just celebrating all the things white people have done. And I think it's a very easy way to just draw a person in, right? It's like, oh yeah, cool. Like I want to celebrate my culture, right? And you have like a very base understanding of all these things. I like. Does everyone else agree? Bruce?
Yeah, like sort of like framing of this that I've heard that seems to make sense is if, like the whole pride thing is shifted more from proud of these given things, these manifestations, and more like, hey, I'm proud that we were able to overcome. I'm proud that we were able to overcome this form of discrimination. I'm proud that we're able to be here today and do what we do today and march on the streets today and do X, Y, and Z. And like through that sort of like lens of analysis instead, or through that just lens in general, it sort of makes a greater degree of understanding as to why there isn't like a straight pride or a white pride to the same extent that there are other forms of pride.
I also wanted to explore this idea of white culture, which comes up, right? And someone on the panel said, like, I don't believe I have culture, and this is like very common in response. You'll hear from some white individuals. Oh, Wordy, if you can mute yourself, we get some loud background noise from you.
Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
But like, what do you think, quote unquote, white culture is? No one answer that.
It is like this thing, like it is like it's nebulous. Like the group that's considered white now, it may not be considered white 100 years from now. Like that, who's considered white is like dependent on like time, right?
So is black.
So like,
I mean, right?
True, that's very true. But like when we say Black Pride, we're talking about a specific people, not all Black people around the world, like Black Americans and their situation in America, right? That's what we're really referring to. So like when it comes to white pride, right? What situation in America happened like to all white people to lead you, or like what adversity or things like that, like we were breaking up.
What
I mean,
adversity
like,
happened to all of us black people?
Yeah, like there's not adversity that happens to all
for
like
Black
all
Americans.
minorities.
I mean, what African Americans, I guess.
I mean, there's a lot, right? But it's not shared.
Yeah, I mean, this was Destiny's previous point about like lack of collective trauma, right? So like, if that's the case.
And again, it's all in how society frames it as well. And I think this point was brought up on the closed panel, is that a lot of times, not every time, obviously, but a lot of times when they want to express um, pride in an accomplishment of their ancestors, it is demonized. Society, as it currently stands, demonizes it and takes that away from them and saying you should be ashamed to be proud of that. That happens. We know that happens. We've seen that happen. Like, does anyone disagree with that? I mean,
I mean, I do
Um,
partially. It depends on like what you're talking about, right? Like if your
oh yeah,
grandfather,
obviously
if
it's
your grandfather
contextual.
happens to be white and he's like proud of like I built this barn, I don't think anybody's like going after him about that. But if you're like, I'm white and I enslaved all these people, look at all this accomplishments of like dominating on these individuals, and I'm like, yeah, people are going to be upset about that, right? So it's like it depends on where is the pride coming from and what is the motivation for the pride. So it's like you could be proud of something that your ancestors did when they're white, but if it happens to be transgressing on other people, obviously people are going to like you shouldn't be proud of that. That's not a good thing to be proud of.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? Like, again, as not to parrot Destiny too much, but when you say, "Hey, my grandfather was a musician, my grandfather was really involved in this music scene," and someone says, "Well, actually, your grandfather probably helped steal that music from someone else," and things like that, and this is what people get told. This has happened.
So
Yeah,
I
like
think you could. I
hold
think
on.
you could
sorry.
possibly go ahead. Go ahead, Worry.
Okay, yeah, like if somebody tries to take away an accomplishment your grandfather did, specifically of like playing music and shit, tell them to shut the fuck up. Like
Right.
they're
Well, I
being an
mean,
idiot. Wait,
sure, but
but if you specifically talk about like how your family like came with the whole process of like immigration in the like 1400s, like you came with the colonies and shit, then you would have to ask some questions there. You're like, you can be proud that you were able to come, your family was able to come over here, but you also have to realize your family fucked over a lot of fucking people, and it doesn't reflect on you for existing as you are now. But if you start to evoke that image of like being proud of like the colonizers and shit, then there's a problem that comes up there is where you're placing the emphasis and a way you're kind of like ignoring the history, right? To be nuanced is to accept the positives and the negatives. And so if you're going to be proud of that, well, you have to say, are you proud of the genocide that happened? And so that's what the question really comes down to.
okay, but you see how that sounds to a normie when there's like, "Hey, my pioneer ancestors, they had to go through a lot of struggles." And then you say, "Well, actually, your pioneer ancestors did a lot of all this," which is true things. I'm not trying to deny that, but I'm just trying to see to kind of illustrate how this comes off. Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I saw during the panel, I think, was that I believe Connor brought up was the idea of simply explaining that certain ethnicities, such as like Italians, Irish, Polish, all that, were not considered white or a part of white culture, and I do conclude of that because a lot of people who wrote during the time, including probably the notorious Robert E. Lee, identified what is the general culture of what he goes on with is Anglo-Saxon culture. Even people or even presidents like I believe Thomas Jefferson specifically was had an emphasis on a lot of like talk with Anglo-Saxon history, culture, and understanding to their identity. So that's something I want to point that out.
So something that I wanted to really touch on is, and that we didn't really get a chance to, is like how whiteness interacts with like your daily life. So for the people who are white here, do you does that happen to you? Like, do you notice
It has
this?
before. I can give you a very specific
All
example.
right, and I want to hear
Right.
from all the rest of the white people too afterwards.
Of
Okay.
Go
course.
ahead.
Well, when I was young, I was in middle school. I was in middle school in Hawaii. My family was military, so I was in a Hawaii Hawaiian school, Aliamanu Middle School. I was one of the only white people there. I was very cognizant of my race in their way. There were places I could not go on campus because they didn't allow haoles there. That's what they called us, haoles, and we just weren't allowed to go. I don't know if it was a rule, but it was definitely an unspoken kind of thing. Because if you did go there, you'd be pulled aside by faculty and by the students and said, "Hey, you're not allowed here." Now, I don't know if that was a written rule or not, but that's what happened. So, yeah, in that experience, I was definitely cognizant of my race.
So, but Wick, to bounce off that, right, is like we can look at the consistency of like experience itself, right? Being white, right? You have to go into very like specific like anecdotal experiences. And I'm not saying your anecdotal experience is any less relevant, but I'm saying is like when we talk about like being socialized into being white versus being black, right? There has to be a consistency, right? You have to go to Hawaii, you have to go to this very specific school, right? In Arkansas, I'm like, great, skin's white, cool, whatever. But like,
Do you think do you think that would be different if you were someone raised, a white person raised in a majority black neighborhood, which
Yeah, that's going to
happens?
be the same with literally every race. Like a black person's experience in like in like a place in DC is going to be way different than like a place in San Francisco or whatever, or like these places are going to be dramatically different no matter what race you are, right? Like if you're the same race in any different area, it's going to be like socialized and everything's going to be way different in terms of the feeling about it.
Yeah, I think anyone can feel excluded, especially if it's very specific kinds of those kinds of specific instances that Wicked was trying to referring to.
Bruce.
Yeah, so in Europe, there's not the same sort of like, like black-white divide as, or POC white divide as there may exist in the US, for instance. Things here tend to be more like along the lines of, are you like a migrant or not? That tends to be like what I would say would be the most comparable sort of like relative comparison I can make there between the black and white discrepancy, or like the relation there in the US compared to here in Europe. Now, obviously, there is an additional component to, for example, like where you may have migrated from. If you migrated from, for example, like China or the US, you're obviously going to might be treated in a different way than if you migrated from, like North Africa or from the Middle East in terms of how people treat you. So there's an element of like of race there still, obviously, but when it comes to just more general social interactions, migration status and whether or not you're a migrant or you're here for your first generation or whatever tends to be a much like larger contributing factor, at least relative to the US.
How long can that hold, right? So so like being, if the split is simply about race, like here in the States, right? Well, also for immigrants, but like if it's about race, well then your race is like, it is what it is, right? And you can't escape from it. Like I can't escape from my black skin, but like, and neither can my children, right? If they're also black. But for migrancy, then it seems like it's something that can be escaped, and that within a generation, for so many, they'd have, the families would have escaped that. Are you saying that's the case,
Yeah.
that just within a
It's
generation?
it's still like interlinked with race to the extent that, hey, more people, when it comes to like discriminatory treatment, for instance, they will infer more likely that, hey, you may be a migrant depending on your race or your complexion or whatever. So there's definitely an interplay between the two there, but it seems like, just like very narrowly, it seems like the status of migrant or like potential migrant seems to be one that that often is a little bit more significant than the racial aspect of it. Although there is like such a massive interplay between the two, it's like impossible virtually to rank them. So yeah, it's a bit of a European perspective, I suppose.
Okay.
And I don't know if I necessarily agree. Like the racial line, the line is always divided at race. I think it has to do a lot of the culture of the individuals, or at least the way they're presenting if they're a part of the culture. I know, like I could go to like a country festival or whatever. I throw on my Afghanistan veteran hat, I tuck in my shirt, I wear my Carhartt, and I throw on like my boots and whatnot. And I walk out there and I get treated significantly different as opposed to if I were just walk out there in some Jordans and look like an outsider, right? So I think a lot of the people are tied to their cultures and they presume it, like oftentimes it's the color of their skin. But if you present in something like, hey, in the same type of clothing or culture, like I'm a part of your culture, I just happen to different skin tone, I think people are a lot more welcoming. As opposed
Yeah,
to
probably
that.
going to be more welcoming, but I don't think it excludes the entirety of the disparate treatment.
I mean, it's still, you're like, don't get me wrong, right? It's still very clear that I'm brown, but it's like, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, but for example, there is an interesting study in Sweden. There's relatively few studies in terms of like racial discrepancies in treatment in Sweden compared to the US, because differences in like the scale of academic institutions, the prominence of discourse relating to race in the two countries. But for instance, one of the major like studies on discrepancies in, for example, treatment of employees between different racial groups here in Sweden analyzed the pay and the performance and the likelihood of employment for very well-educated Black Americans in the medical field. and it found very stark discrepancies between your pay, your likelihood to be employed, even among people that you would consider upper echelon society, fairly well integrated into the culture, right? They have like PhDs and shit like that. They're working in the medical industry, but yet this disparate treatment tends to still remain, even in Europe, despite this. So
I just want to ask New Salsa a question here because I think that
What's up, buddy?
costuming only works so far. Like, for example, if I was living in Puerto Rico or an indigenous area or an area or let's go with Hawaii again. If I were to try to fit in and to be treated different in the Hawaiian culture by dressing up in Hawaiian garb, there's going to be a lot of different reaction than if you try to dress
So
up in a traditional culture of, say, Appalachia or thing. You see the difference there? You see what
so
would happen?
it's gonna have to enter different culture, right? It's gonna have to enter different culture, and right. And I run the risk of saying this because I'm not black. I don't identify as black, right? But I've seen it, right, where there are white people that exist that have an N-word pass, right? And they've been a part of black culture long enough where they can walk around other black folk and whatever, or they can walk around black folk and they get the pass or whatever bullshit like that, right? So it's like I think you have to understand it depends on your culture and the way that culture accepts, because maybe the Hawaiian culture they may not accept it at all, right? Or they're like, you have to be this, right? I hear Japan can be like that sometimes, but it specifically, I guess mainland US, right? Because it is Hawaii, that's still the US. It's like and it's specifically when we're talking about like white institutions and black or minorities jumping to there, it's like I've seen plenty of times where it's like, oh, it's clear you're an ally to me, right? To the Appalachian thing. I don't know about Appalachian, but like to other stuff right here.
So
Go ahead,
Mhm.
Rose. Go
I
ahead.
was I think there's also a connection. I don't think like completely divorcing, topics of race from culture from another is going to be productive because there's a massive amount of interplay between the two. So, for instance, you could also ask the question, okay, so in what ways does society influence individuals on the basis of their race? When it comes to, like influencing them towards engaging in certain cultures over others or forming certain types of behavior within their culture. So typically one of the arguments you often hear is, hey, issues relating to racism or whatever, nothing to do with race, has everything to do with culture. Well, then you can ask the question then, okay, so why do Black Americans tend to have this type of like Black culture that you may be criticizing? Oh, well, it stems from da. And eventually you work back, and you get to, at some point, racially disparate treatments that then influence the cultural behaviors of different groups of people in different ways. So I just don't think that this separation of culture from race and saying that, oh, okay, is nothing to do with one, it's only the other, is most certainly not productive.
I don't think anybody's saying it has nothing to do with one or the other. I think at least I'm saying, right, is like the line isn't strictly boom. It's not simply like your race. It's not your skin tone. Or if it's not, where if somebody's like, nah, I grew up in an all white neighborhood. I grew up listening to Garth Brooks. I grew up listening to all this country stuff or whatever's relevant to that culture. I'm 100% part of this culture. Like, sorry, dog, you're brown, so we have to exclude you as if you were from the hood. Like, I don't think that type of exclusion is going to occur.
So what specifically are we talking about? Are we talking like interpersonal stuff, or are we talking about like larger systemic discrepancies?
I'm personally talking about like interpersonal stuff. When we're talking like institution wise and everything else like that, 100%, right? Like I think the data that you presented, or at least you advocated for, like I believe in that full force. But if we're talking about like interpersonal relationships and the way people like actually function within themselves, I think it's a little bit different.
So, Stephen, something you had said before, and we didn't get really a chance to jump into on this, right? Talking about hurt, right? And like judging levels of hurt. The question that I think we're dancing around was whether it was possible to be racist towards whites, right? I think that's what the question a lot of people have their mind. And I want to know everyone's opinion on this, right? Like, do you think that's a possibility? Are you with this academic sense that you cannot be racist towards whites because of an imbalance in power? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the answer to this is obviously yes. Any other answer is such easy conservative fodder for such a dumb answer otherwise. We can argue that there is systemic racism, and then people like, as a class, blacks probably can't be systemically racist or structurally racist against whites, but like on an individual level, anybody can be racist towards anybody, of course.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
I agree with that.
Quill.
I mean, I basically agree. Like, interpersonal, like individual racism compared to institutional or structural racism are two completely different things. I think a lot of people try to conflate the two and say that racism is institutional racism, and the word you're looking for is prejudice. Not that that changes the ethics or morals of your actions towards a white person. If that action is considered racist, you can absolutely discriminate against a white person because they're white on an individual level.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it really comes down to the interesting question is like when we talk about like blending into Appalachian territories, right? In a way, there's a lot of expectations with like interacting with like a white majority culture is that you're expected to assimilate it, right? Like for being a black person, maybe they're expected to address a different way than what maybe they're raised with and all that stuff. And then the question comes down to like when you interact at a WIC in like the dominant Hawaiian culture, there is a little bit of a defense mechanism sometimes, I think, within minority communities. And I'm not saying it's not without cause, like, the whole history of treatment of different minority groups, right? And I think it also like extends to the queer community as well as like the defensive mechanism towards like straight people coming in within those spaces. And I think in a way, we don't have to like necessarily change the culture, but we have to realize that people are going to interact within those cultures. It doesn't mean we have to be like antagonistic. There's like there comes down to a level is like assimilation versus like acceptance, and in the way we have to figure out the way we can all work, interact, and still display components of our culture while also maintaining that we don't have to necessarily go with complete exclusion.
So when talking about these levels of hurt, though, right? Using the do we have to call it a C word? I'm gonna say cracker. I'm gonna say cracker. I'm assuming that we don't have to.
I don't give a fuck.
Okay, great. But equating that to the N word, right? So if it's just interpersonal, and there's nothing else behind it, then I guess we're saying that that these things can be have some sort of equivalence.
Well, no, just because
Hey.
something is bad doesn't mean it has to be as bad as the other thing, right? We can think of a ton of racial slurs, and not all of them have to be the same level of badness. Like things can still be bad, right?
Yeah, it's like if we recognize the difference between getting punched in the arm and getting shot in the arm. Both hurt, both cause harm, obviously causes way more harm. We still don't want to make it okay to just go and punch people in the arm. It still does damage, not as much, but it's like, well, it's not a shot in the arm, so it's okay. It's a weird argument to make. Like, at least I didn't shoot you in the arm. It's just a weird way to go with it.
Chris, if you had your hand up previously, then Quill.
Yeah, I mean they basically covered it. But yeah, mostly online I see a lot of white people using like cracker. I don't see that many black people, like even growing up, like that word it doesn't have much use and it's not really that effective. It's kind of funny, but like that's it. But like it's used a lot in online spaces for some reason. It's really weird.
So I'm just using that as an example, right? Like I don't know, use whatever term or phrase or action, right? To do it. So like it doesn't have to be that. Just those. That's an easy comparison. But sorry, did someone else have their hand up? Sorry, go ahead.
I think I'm going to be heading out though. I got to go do some research for a panel on Saturday.
Bye.
So, peace.
Rage.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Okay. I would agree that they're not equivalent, but going around calling people any sort of slur based on race is not cool. It's weird, cringe.
Yeah, just honestly calling people outside their name when they don't want to be called outside their name is just weird. Like if you don't know them, don't like, hey, stupid or whatever, right? That's not a racial slur. But there are people that turn around like, what'd you say? Like we're gonna have problems. My name is this, not that. It's I don't know.
Will.
No, I mean, there's not more to.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say every insult is not a slur. So sometimes it's funny to call people out of their names because they're being dumb. And I take pleasure in that sometimes. So
yeah, I would think that there's slightly different between like calling somebody a dummy versus saying you're being dumb. I mean, difference. But yeah, what you just said is true. That not every insult is right.
Should we? It reminds me of something. Then, should we? Is there value in shaming people? This is something I sort of disagreed with previously. So, like when we socialize kids, when kids are socialized, like on the schoolyard, they are oftentimes it's through shame, right? Like you do something that's outside the norm, and then other kids let you know, and then you don't do it again, right? So
shame only matters when it comes from people that you respect, or like the person who's being shamed respects the person's opinion, right? If you're just like random online and like some random other person like says you're an idiot or blah 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 blah, or tries to shame you for whatever reason, you're not really going to care. It's not going to really be effective,
That's not
right?
true.
I
Enough
disagree, because you could
people.
look at the schoolyard. What are the kids doing? They're trying to advocate. They're trying to like vibe to get more friends. They're trying to be their friends, right? You can
Yeah,
look
but
at parents
doesn't
and children situation, like the children, right? They're being shamed by their parents because they respect their parents. They want their parents to think highly of them. But
but
it's like,
enough strangers like shaming you for something, you can definitely feel shame from that.
I mean,
Like you
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
how
often
reasonable and effective
shame
that should
can.
come about, right?
Sorry.
If you have all of the U.S. shaming you, sure, but like
Yeah.
in reality, there's people like, I don't give a flying fuck. Like I don't know 5,000 of you. None of you matter on Twitter. Like why do I care
True,
what you?
and that's great, but not. I don't think a lot of people have that super thick skin that you do, and I wish we all did. But I think often shame can start to build up on some people, and often it usually leads them to making them do bad things because of the shame that they often get building up. But I
so
do think that we all should get a little more thick. Sorry, go ahead.
no, it's fine. No, thank you for adding that. So like the idea of Karens, right? Like, is this a good strategy? So we see a white woman do some nonsense on TV, right? On they're filmed, the videos, right? Is like well doing that well shaming these kinds, not it may not change that individual, right? Who knows what that
Hmm.
individual is thinking, but that is useful to change the behavior of others, right? So they see white women gone wild on their TV,
Uh-huh.
right, and then see the backlash at them. Is that a useful thing? Go ahead, Rage, and then Quill, and then Wick.
I do agree that it's a useful thing. I don't like attaching it to like the word Karen, and then that proliferates as just calling people Karen, even especially because the definition gets vague and people just start using it as an insult rather than to have the social utility of shaming. They just call people Karen because they're acting in a way that they don't like them to.
Yeah.
Um, I
Karen
hate
is
when
misogynistic, 100%.
I hate when shaming is based on immutable characteristics. So kind of like Karen now, because Karen, like when we think of the word Karen or the term Karen, not like the actual name, but the term Karen, it's a white woman. Like that's not. I don't like the words used in that way. Shaming a person on even okay, even though somebody's weight is not an immutable characteristic, I don't think fat shaming is a good way to get across that point. But if somebody comes into this server and they're acting really, really dumb and they're interrupting people, we can shame them, say, hey, you're not being respectful, you're not being appropriate. And that sort of social pressure, I think that's very effective. And we can do that within society, like across America. There are things we can do. We can shame somebody for being racist. We can shame somebody, well, depends on how you use that term. Like that term's been overused in some ways too. But like we can shame people for behaviors, not characteristics, is what I think.
But you can shame them. But Steven said earlier that, and this is where I was disagreeing with him, is that you can't change their behavior through shame. That's not an effective tool of making that happen. Instead, I think your point was that you'd have to talk to them or like use some sort of other like compassionate manner. But like we don't have the option to do that all the time. And even
I
if
think it could work. I think you can shame people into different behaviors, but as Salsa was just saying, it has to come from somebody that they respect. Like if there's a bunch of liberals who are trying to shame a bunch of conservatives who don't care what they think, that's not going to
Yes.
work.
Yeah.
But if there's a conservative like talk show host or whatever, and they actually have like a decent morals or whatever, like so like a normal mainstream conservative, not like a like the alt right or whatever, but they say, hey, you're in our community, that's not cool. Don't do that. If that's coming from somebody you respect, I think it can change your behavior.
Quill.
Reinforcement is a much better term for this, I think, because I think I don't know if positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement is any better in the other, But I do think that trying to reinforce certain habits on people to make them change, I think is like a better way of trying to trying to do that instead of just outright just completely shaming them. Which I'm not implying that like anyone here is trying to say that, but I do think that I don't think shaming should be the first option, I guess.
Let's go to Wick, then Quill.
Oh, okay. Shame can work in certain circumstances. The problem with shame is that it comes with some baggage.
I
So
love you
when we
guys. Be
use
careful.
shame as a
Fine.
tool, it
Bye-bye.
has some unattended consequences that I
Dude.
don't think that we want to have. When we look at how we raise children, yes, you can definitely influence a child's behavior through shaming them every time they make a mistake, but we know this causes issues. We know that this causes a lot of real kind of we need therapy in the future issues. So yes, shame can work, but positive reinforcement works as well, and it works without those negative dangerous kind of baggage that comes with it.
Go ahead, Quill, Dari, Salsa, Dan.
Yeah, I just feel like across the board, most people will take shame negatively. Like, it depends, but it goes situation by situation because you have to determine whether the person that you're trying to either shame or correct or educate is like how good faith they're in, how um how crazily determined they are to the ideal that they have that they're expressing, and just how well the likelihood of either or, like the likelihood of you getting through to them by shaming them, or the likelihood of getting through to them by carefully explaining it to them through a logical perspective. And I feel that most Karens, even like I feel like when I say Karen, I mean like people who have like some sort of racial bias or ethnic bias, like the typical Karen video where she wild out on a minority for some story. It's like you have to depict whether it's worth it or not to shame that person or not shame them based on how in good faith they are or how strongly they believe what they believe.
All right, Dari.
Dairy.
Sorry.
Yeah. So shaming. Sorry, one moment. Yeah. So shaming can be like a toolbox that you use to change somebody. Although I would question the motives of somebody who is implementing shame to like truly try to change somebody. So it's possible that good outcomes can happen from bad things, but I must have missed the point where it's like, hey, you know what? Let's start shaming people to make some real change in people's attitudes, or let alone on a systematic scale.
Okay, then Salsa and Dan and Rose.
Did you say it was Dari or Dairy?
Dairy.
Dairy. Yeah, no, I agree with Dairy on this take, right? Where it's like, I feel like a lot of people who are actually participating, for the example that you gave, Prime, when it came down to the Karens, they're just doing that to get some clout or to post their stuff online or to like get some reaction for entertainment value or whatever. They're not actually, I feel some people maybe are doing it for a way to like, hey, we need to adjust this type of behavior. But in reality, it's like, this person's freaking out. I want to see this person freak out. And they don't have like better, like more like better faith interpretations of why they're trying to like shame individuals, right? And I don't, and to talk about, I think what like Swamp Fox was even talking about yesterday, right? When like everybody was throwing a fit, was if you are rude to like significant amount of people, you're just going to entrench them, right? Just like I don't know if everybody saw that that quick video that released like a day or two ago of the conservative who just got COVID, right? Just got COVID. It's getting out of it, saying, would you get the vaccine now to avoid everything, like, being intubated and everything? Is like, no, I wouldn't, because they're trying to push it and they're being rude to me. And like that same idea is like the same, where it's like, now I wouldn't be surprised, because like the Karen thing has been going on for a hot minute, but we still see that type of behavior going out. Like maybe it's very difficult. We don't have any data on this besides like YouTube videos and Facebook stuff and whatnot. But I wouldn't be surprised if some people are just like, I embrace this now. Like, this is just a part of me. If you're doing this, whatever. Like, because they don't respect you, so they don't care if you shame them. It's like, I'm out here trying to get what's my right, which they honestly and firmly believe. But it's like, and you're just trying to deprive me of that. Why do I respect what you say? But if you come to them in a nice, softer way, right? Like, hey, you need to calm down like a little bit. You need to relax or whatever. And like, maybe not necessarily those words, but in a different type of methodology, I think you can come like a lot of progress from that.
All right, let's and then Rose.
Well, I definitely would agree with many of you guys that even with it denormalizes for a good thing to treat people nicer when you create a whole entire stereotype of white, even though it's like case to a stereotype of white women being very much put in a box where all that. But however, it's not simply going to assume to all white women are like this. But it does, in the end, I think entirely will help out to make people be more aware of the situation of racism or common sense through much of the whole area, even and how now everyone now has cell phones and everyone can be recorded. But it's, I mean, treat people nice is what I always would say.
Rose, and then Titan.
Yeah, in regards to the Karen thing, I think it's perfectly possible to criticize those negative behaviors without involving like misogynistic tropes to do so. When it comes to like criticizing and like on more of an individual, but I would say also on like a more like collective social community level. One of the absolute best ways to ensure that the person you're criticizing is going to take literally nothing of it to heart is to attack something that is immutable about them or something that is a stereotype or something that they face frequently. So if we always like bake in criticisms of like behaviors of certain like entitled often like middle class women and just wrap like certain like criticisms that can be made towards the behavior in just like a massive shroud of like misogyny or just general like misogynistic tropes, those people they're not going to listen, they're going to tune out. And yeah, sure, we on the internet we're going to have a bunch of fun videos to laugh at and do stuff with, but it's not actually going to produce something. It's entirely possible to critique these people in a more like responsible manner that's going to be more effective, and that also probably is going to make sure that the points we make and the criticisms we make are more like directed at the actual behavior instead of just people like venting other frustrations they may have through like the current trend. But with that, I am going to head off. It is 6:43 a.m. The light right now is sunlight that I have on me right now. I've been up all night at the panel. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Prime. I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
And I hope you and everyone else on the panel has a nice rest of their day.
Have a good one.
I'm
Good
gonna
morning.
head out too. So thanks again. I love it here. It was fun. Bye.
Thank you. Go ahead, Titan.
Bye bye, guys.
I think that this is like entirely stupid with how you guys are approaching this. Okay, social ostracization works when it comes to these behaviors. Okay, Karens did not fucking logic bro themselves into acting with a sense of entitlement and social impunity to act the way they are. Okay, there's a sense of self-aggrandizement that they have that makes them feel superior to other individuals, and when you detach that from them and when you mock them and go strictly against that, people are not getting more ingrained. Okay. And if it does, that's really not the fault of the individuals, because you're not going to change that semblance of behavior instantly. Your goal really is never to be talking to that individual. Your goal is to get all the other people to be scared shitless for doing behaviors like that, okay? We watch from other individuals on how they act in public, and if we see that there's a level of social ostracization, we're not going to mimic that behavior, okay? Just the same way that like a stupid fucking conservative isn't going to get the vaccine. Remember, conservatives don't fucking logic bro themselves into being anti-vax. They don't logic bro themselves into being conservatives in general. That's why they are so fucking fearful to literally everything, okay? Like a leaf turns brown and they think that's white genocide, all right? That's just how they are, and just because a fucking Karen wants to do that, it's not really something that you're going to be able to logic them out of, okay?
You just push, like, I can 100% see where some of the things you're advocating for, but like you're just pushing people like more, like you're not going to be able to reach these people at all.
Your goal, you're not supposed to reach that person. You're supposed
and I guess that's where I disagree.
No, you're not supposed to reach that person.
Yeah.
That person's worthless. That person's long gone. Fuck them. They can
I
be.
think there's just like a fundamental. I'm sorry to cut you out. I think there's just like a fundamental disagreement of like why we're going into these conversations in the first place. I think a lot of people on this panel want to actually talk to these specific kinds of individuals and
No, you
try
don't.
to figure
No, you
out like
No,
a
you do not
compromise.
want. No, you
Okay,
do not
well,
want
that's
to go to
fine.
a, You do not want to go to a fucking grocery
But-
store where some Karen is like bitching about their receipt and
Yeah.
how like an item was scanned twice. Trust me, that is not something you want to put up with. That is not something that anybody's going to be like. Now listen here, you can understand that sometimes an item does get scanned twice, and that may lead to an extra charge on it. No one's fucking dealing with that, okay? You're dealing with somebody that's acting completely irrational, taking something that is completely worthless, and they're making it this absolute large-scale ordeal, and that's being done, initiated by them. They are in the wrong inherently for their level of behavior. Your goal is not to be reaching them, because that's not going to happen in the instant. Your goal is to be reaching literally every single other person in this environment, because it happens in public settings to show that this is not an acceptable amount of behavior, and that there are certain social norms that when you do not adhere to them, they'll be very much looked down upon. And guess what? If it has to go to fucking Twitter over and over again, then so be it, okay?
Let's go to Rage.
While I agree, I definitely agree that social ostracism, it works. That's not that peer pressure is a good thing, but humans as social creatures, we interact with each other, we get social cues from each other, and pressuring people to say this is not okay, this is not appropriate, that works. That's how we have the norms of society. And I agree with the example of somebody who's acting crazy in a grocery store, ostracizing that behavior. It's not targeted at that person, it's targeted at everybody else. I agree with you with that. When you start applying it to political perspectives, like saying I don't think that would work to get conservatives on your side. One, there are too many conservatives in this country for they don't need your approval. They have their own group. Like with the example of individuals who are being crazy in the grocery store, there is no collective group that has that identity. So they don't have like a safe group to say, oh yeah, we still share these opinions with. So I don't think you can connect those two. On top of that, similar to what Salsa was saying, I do think the rhetoric that you were using there would definitely drive people away. Like when you're saying that somebody is so fearful of everything that if a leaf turns brown, they believe that's white genocide. That's so hyperbolic and crazy that nobody, like that sort of thing, that's not going to convince anybody.
I don't really care
Yeah.
about like the fucking feelings of a person like at a grocery store, but absolutely you can relate this to politics, okay? There's actually a reason why conservatives are so fucking scared of everything, and that's because they think it's like
But that's not even that. Even that's not technically true. Like we've done studies, and there's more mental illness on for younger people. Well, younger people tend to be more liberal in general, but like we've done studies and like
that's
depression,
because
anxiety, and
conservatives do not have like a belief in mental illness, and they very much pick themselves up by your bootstraps. Like, they do not believe in that foundation of it, okay? They're completely fucking gone with that, okay? Yes, just because people on the left are understanding of like what mental illness is and know that depression isn't just like I felt sad because I got scraped my knee is a bit different than conservatives who think that literally everything is like an infringement on them, okay? That's why like social ostracization
I don't even
works
think
super. Wait, that's actually why it works super well, because conservatives literally think everything is an infringement on their status in society.
This is so hyperbolic. I don't.
No, it's not. Wait, you teach about racism. That's
Not
all
every
critical
single.
racism,
Not
and
every
now
single.
that's like an
Okay.
infringement on
Titan,
them.
I don't even think that's
you're
a
loading way
conservative.
too much onto this right now, Titan.
Wait, no, it's
I
not.
think
Literally,
you should try to
literally
try to
anything.
calm it down a bit.
Wait, everything to a conservative is like an infringement on them.
What is a conservative to you? Like I don't even know this. This is like a
anybody I don't like is a conservative. Okay, so like if you into league, you're a conservative.
This conversation is
I think this is a good like this is. So here's a super interesting anecdotal Andy fucking time, right? I moved to Florida from Las Vegas, and I moved to Miami Beach, right? And I happened to stay with my nice roommate, and I stayed in a very nice place. It was like $3,000 rent. It was very expensive, right? A lot of the people there naturally were conservative, plus it's Florida, right? And so I had like the immediate friends in my friend group on my floor all leaned right. The vast majority of them voted Trump or they voted libertarian, right? Like this is just like the reality of the situation. And like actually speaking to them and actually talking to them and like getting to know them, it's not that way, right? Like you could slowly turn people, you can slowly talk to people, you can slowly like befriend somebody. And just because someone's conservative doesn't mean like, oh, I'm not. It's like they oftentimes when I spoke to them, they just had like a misunderstanding of what's going on, or the perception that they had, which they thought was the reality, is not the reality, because they need somebody that they can respect, which I'm talking to them calmly and smoothly and everything else like that. And then like, okay, oh, now what you're saying makes a little bit more sense. Maybe I see the issue. I moved a guy to Black Lives Matter because of that, because he had a slight experience with police, right? Where someone didn't believe him, right? And I was like, now you can start seeing it, because both of the cops happen to be Latin or like Cuban or whatever. They spoke Spanish to each other and you felt ostracized. This is oftentimes the way Black people may feel about stuff like that. He's like, you know what? Actually, that ain't too fucking far-fetched now. right? And then they start slowly moving over. Like,
Yeah.
Let me add to this. So there's two situations we're actually talking about here. And this is actually something that can tie into the earlier conversation on the panel to now, and something I hope people will take in the future. And that's dealing with an individual versus dealing with a system. Now, as an individual in the grocery store who's acting up, it might be in best interest to remove them in as quick a possible way and deal with the standards as quick as a possible way that seems efficient by the store. However, when we're talking about systematic issues, we have to take a different approach. We can't demonize people from the right, and we can't, maybe if we're all right, demonize people on the left. It doesn't work. Now, more people voted for Biden than any other president. Something to keep in mind is the second most voted for president is Trump. We cannot go with this idea where we're just trying to bully people out of their positions. We need to take a more practical approach instead of keeping cynic and thinking these people are irreproachable. They cannot be convinced. We have to demonize them. I mean, that was shit for Hillary. And I hope discourse continues to be more on a basis of uniting than divisive. And that, again, that starts with the systematic approach versus the individual. We have to clear those two things up.
Yeah.
Wait. You like Hillary lost because she was a terrible candidate.
Yeah.
Not just this like one.
Yeah.
simple
Don't get bogged on the Hillary thing. Just take.
But that
take
was
my
one
point.
of the reasons she lost, was because she demonized a significant portion of the population. But yeah, that's part of the reason she was a bad candidate. But I just got here, so go ahead.
So, okay.
Is Titan gonna respond to that, or is he just gonna?
Well, I guess
I just think it's funny to me watching a bunch of people learn in real time what a social construct is. So I mean, are we gonna keep doing this dumbass conversation, or are we gonna go to something a bit more productive here? Like, there's an understanding that Karen and the social construction of a Karen is fluid. However, there's also an understanding that what Karen is predominantly, if you had to very distinctively define it, is that you could say it's a white woman using their racial privilege as a weapon. You could also say it's someone being an obnoxious rule follower. You can also say it's a no-fun hysterical mom. All of those things are true. All those things are not true, because the social construct of Karen changes based on the situation that you're appearing. The reason why you see Karen generally speaking attached to the left is because the left made a lot of very interesting culture war adjacent arguments. An example, the conservative right has a MO of denying the existence of racism, and if not racism, systemic racism. You could also say, predominantly speaking, on the right, there's a call to an end of social distancing and masking. That's within the right-wing rhetoric. And the question is, how much of that right-wing rhetoric is consistent among the individuals who are using their privilege as a weapon? And predominantly, it's conservative women. Now, to say that the examples that you see across the United States are, in fact, conservative women, that's an unfalsifiable claim. However, if there's an understanding, and Titan laid this out, that certain rhetoric, rhetorical rhetoric on the right currently, is adjacent to what we see white women across the United States being in uproars about, whether it be the denying of systemic racism, to the calling of the end of social distancing, to making sure that kids are back in school because kids need to be in school in person, and if they are in school in person, they need to not be wearing masks. This is all just rhetorically consistent with what the right is currently doing and the culture war conversation broadly. But it's just interesting how that acknowledgement of that is true throughout this entire conversation, but then there's all this weird fighting about social construct, isn't this, isn't that? Yeah, it's all of those things and none of those things at the same time. That's why the term Karen is fluid.
I don't think the conversation was necessarily so attached. At least now we're evolved from initially 100%.
It was pretty fucking stupid.
I disagree, because as far as effective conversations that are some of the more better conversations to have, talking about how to change people into how to be more approachable and how to get people to convince you or to come over to your side, presuming most of the people are on the left, it's probably most of the productive conversations that we could possibly have. Realistically. right?
Sure,
So like,
but using,
I
but using
buck
it,
the way that you came in with it though.
but using it with using Karens as the justification to start having that conversation is the exact reason why Black people get so frustrated about talking about race in the United States. It's that like instead of actually talking about the issue at hand, they're skirting around the issue using very soft, socially palatable things to get people on board. When I don't think that necessarily needs to happen. Like, we can have these conversations, tackling the head on, straight on, and if we want to do that, we can do that. But
I think
like,
Karen was a stand-in for a slur or something
yes,
tangentially
because
related.
it's a social construct and it's fluid.
There might be harsher slurs to use in Karen, but I think at the time it was just a stand-in for someone's example.
No. Karen is the new N-word.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's the new
Like, I
N-word
guess
and not the
realistically,
new.
like what
It's equal parts.
would be
Like
the
that
harsher
statement
word?
is like equal parts true and not true. Again, it's a socially constructed thing that you can describe in multiple different ways. Like, so to say that the
most
slur is
things, most things are socially constructed. So I mean,
yeah.
That's
I don't understand
if you're trying to kind of like critique what we were talking about in terms of effectiveness, just saying something's a social construct might not be that effective.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
but I feel like the main point is that the fact that the word Karen has not a lot of backing in its what it could be definitively defined as, it's
Sure.
extremely fluid. You can call almost anybody a Karen.
Which
So
is what I
That's
said.
right, Karen.
yeah,
I'm
so it's
not
not the fact that he called
sure.
it a social construct. It's a construct. It's the fact that it's social construct and it's extremely fluid.
Which is what I said.
Yeah, and that's
I think we
That's
can
where you
all agree
differentiate,
there,
right?
What you said,
No, that's where you differentiate because you have like Karen, and then you have like Karen with the hard R, and that completely changes the context.
Good one, Sam. That's a funny one.
Just Karen is a name.
I think
yeah. Well, Karen is a name that peaked in significance in the 1960s, and then we also know that we have demographic data to confirm this. That a vast majority of Karens in the United States are middle-aged women. Considering that around 80% of the population in the United States is American, white. It's very easy to get the connection that Karen is describing a middle-aged white woman. Like, I don't know.
Right. Like, but I guess you could take just about any label and like regress it that way, right? So it's like you can say like, what is a black person?
You can try right now. Like, do we have something else that
Yeah.
reaches that
Okay.
bar?
Cool. Like, give me a black person. What does they look like?
I don't know where this is going.
No, like
I don't like where this is going.
I'm trying to, because you could take Karen, right? And there are a multitude of ways that you could express in the way that they're going to come out. But when you say Karen, you even brought it up, right? From the 1960s about middle-aged woman freaking out, probably has short hair. Everybody has that.
No, I
common
didn't say
idea.
short. I
Everybody
didn't
has
say
that.
short hair.
I said short hair. I
Sure.
said short hair.
Like,
And I
do
feel
you want me to
comfortable
repeat
saying
what
that
I
it's probably
said,
popping up
or
when they say short hair.
do you want me to repeat what I said a little bit slower, or do you want me to? I don't know, because
We don't
again,
need,
sometimes
we
my
don't need
mic
to go a
cuts
little
out.
bit slower. We don't need to disrespect one another.
My microphone cuts out from time to time, and I've been on panels where my microphone cuts out. Prime has said it multiple times, and other panels have said. So sometimes my mic randomly cuts out, which is why I said sometimes I have to be slower.
Okay.
For the record, your mic's been coming in clear.
Okay, great. So again, Karen peaked in popularity of names in the 1960s, specifically 1965. The most popular name in the 1960s. Among that, Karen demographically was middle age. So the vast majority of people in the 1960s with that name were middle-aged women. Considering that 80% of the population currently, over under, right, is white, it's safe to make the assumption that Karen is describing a white person.
Probably.
That is
most of the time.
Okay.
Just
Yeah.
learned something.
I don't think anybody's disagreeing with that. I'm confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you went
Yeah,
like,
I'm very
like you were
confused
going
about the
down the
debate.
road, I didn't know what kind of road you were going down. That's all.
I guess
That's
I guess what I was trying to say is it sounded like to me, and let me know if I misunderstood your point, is that when you're bringing up Karen, right, and how like worthless the conversation was, or not very valuable the conversation was about Karen, because Karen can be like it's a huge range of what the possible people that could be up in, correct?
Sure.
Is that what you're saying?
Karen
Right?
can be used and has been used as a substitute to talk about white privilege in the United States.
Sure. I guess I can agree with that, but I
So
can agree
like
with that.
I'd love to talk about the privilege conversation, especially considering that like there's a conflation between whiteness and trying to make the connection of whiteness to blackness when the two are not at all related. Like, that's a conversation that we had, because people use their privilege to dilute that conversation to try to conflate whiteness and blackness together. And then rhetorically, if we want to abolish whiteness, predominantly white people, when they hear abolish whiteness, they automatically think that black people and minorities are advocating for white genocide, which is absolutely not the case.
Okay. Yeah, does anyone want to tackle this topic? Sounds interesting to me.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
you guys mind if I chime in a little quick?
Go ahead.
Real quick. Yeah, so one thing that I've always had an interest in is like linguistics, and especially the fluidity and the constantly evolving nature of language. Like the stuff that we're talking about, how the frequently change, because that's one thing I've noticed is the term Karen, that what that definition is in people's brain frequently changes. That is a perfect example of how language is very fluid and constantly evolves, and that's another thing that I've used to develop my counter arguments to people who like get all freaked out about neopronouns or whatnot. But that's kind of irrelevant here. But yeah, I think it's what are the words I'm looking for? It's this is a good place to start like diving into, the power dynamics of linguistics and whatnot, because this hasn't been all that prevalent in English in terms of the modern language, although maybe more so in England than the United States. But in some languages, in some societies, there have even been like the languages spoken by the ruling class and the language spoken by the commoner were different to the point where they could almost be considered separate languages. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish that was like written down and the immediate predecessor to the modern Turkish language was very influenced by Persian and actually bore very little mutual and was so different to the from the Turkish language that the like average Turkish person spoke in the Ottoman Empire. That to the point that the commoner could actually like almost have trouble understanding somebody from like the nobility classes.
Okay.
And
so, sorry for interrupting. I just had I don't think this is that much relevant. We don't have like literally the British like family going and speaking German in their like private lives.
But I'd say Beer Bass Johnson is knocking on a very perfect door here, because again, like the modern right wing right now is like battling against critical race theory, and they're using like the exact same arguments about we can't like, and this is like literally what Christopher Rufo is acknowledged that he wants to do, is to obfuscate the definitions used, obfuscate what the terms used, so even when they're using it, they become these dog whistles. Like something as simple as racial equity, that like Chris Rufo argues that this is just a dog whistle to talk about cultural Marxism. Whiteness is just a dog whistle to advocate for the genocide of white Americans. Another things like racial equality is even a dog whistle to Maoist and pro-China rhetoric. Like this is something that Chris Rufo is doing. This is something that the culture war right is doing, from the Ted Cruz's and Tom Cottons of the world, all the way down to the local people running for office, like Paul Lott, who's running in the 10th district in Virginia. Like rhetorically, they're trying to obfuscate what these words mean, despite the fact that like a lot of like the words to describe these phenomena are clearly defined, but because the populace might not understand that, you're using that to their advantage. So when people hear critical race theory, they have no idea what it means, but that's perfect for them because they can create legislation restricting it. Like they can say that like, okay, whiteness actually advocates for the genocide of white people. So then they can make legislation, which they have, that openly restricts the teaching of not only gender pronouns, but just like LGBTQ plus education, as well as racial education. So like they've done that and they're winning.
So wait, what's the position being argued here? Because I think most people here would probably agree that conservatives lie about words, and their politicians specifically
yes, they
want
constantly
to
do.
Yeah. So like,
right, that's my point.
I'm just
like
kind of curious what
the right is using. So like the problem here is that, and I guess I'll propose the concept here is that critical race theory is being challenged all over the United States right now a majority of states have legislation either banning it or restricting it. But then the justification of why they're banning it is that it's this pro-communist, cultural Marxist adjacent anti-white agenda, and it's using to advocate for the genocide of white people. And even in the legislation, it makes it very clear that they're openly trying to make sure that nobody teaches about the idea that one race is superior than the other, or the idea that meritocracy is racist and American values are racist. And even something as far as what Texas did is that within their own bill, they initially acknowledged that one of the revisions was that the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacy are morally evil. And then Republicans in Texas removed that part of the legislation out. And then all the drafters, like, we bipartisanly agreed on this rhetoric existing. And then all of a sudden it disappeared, and even the editor couldn't explain it. Like, how does the editor and writer of the very bill not be able to articulate why white supremacy and Ku Klux Klan being morally wrong and evil is just removed from a bill? And then, like, when from the outside looking in, it's like, this is a little strange.
Rage.
Well,
Nathan,
sorry, go ahead,
Nathan and Rage. No, Nathan and then Rage. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to sound dumb, but so I get what you're saying. The Republicans lie about critical race theory, and the politicians that talk about it have no idea what they're saying. And a long thing was brought up earlier by another person, the person that just joined, talking about linguistics. But it's been a while since I've done a debate. But like, what's exactly being like the positions going up against each other? I'm confused.
The argument here, and I'll make it even more clear, is that critical race theory and equity education, whiteness studies, whiteness, racial equality, all of these things are just a dog whistle to cater to the extreme left Marxist and cultural Marxist ideology and pushing those agendas onto school-age children.
Are you arguing those positions, or you're saying
No,
that the
that's the
Republicans who
right-
say that
The
are
right
the
is
ones that are
active-
lying about it?
Right. The right is actively
Okay.
doing that right now. And then the
Okay,
question is
so,
like,
yeah.
and then like the point of the contention is that like if we understand that like that's not the case, then how are we as members of the left or even people who are like Democrats or sock Dems supposed to challenge this rhetoric, right? Like what's the approach if we understand that they're obfuscating this language?
I would say the approach is to just do what we can, get more people looking at our stuff, and spread the truth. Just like legit, just say what these things mean, and hopefully,
So then what's the-
we fill the sound waves over them. I don't think we can necessarily like stop the Fox News from spreading bullshit, but hopefully we can just challenge them in the battleground of ideas. But yeah.
Well, I mean,
Like,
sure.
Yeah. So as we all know, and as you pointed out yourself, Joe, is that like Karen, words flow and change. And so I don't think there's any hold on what critical race theory is in the general public. I think it's just still an ambiguous thing. But there's actually a right-wing individual who put out an impactful statement, I think, to his people, and let him speak, is that critical race theory is a way to look at, in his words, white rage, and what that could mean, and among other few details. But his main speech was criticizing some of the more maybe conservative right-wing people who are against critical race theory, or who are pushing an agenda against critical race theory, and pushing the idea that you'd be against something that can teach as fundamentally ridiculous on its own merits. So just their pushback was even what he was critiquing, not even necessarily supporting critical race theory, but just the attack on the idea of learning more about what this might have to teach. And so when it comes to rhetoric to help things, I think that is one example that even comes from someone that isn't quite left.
Sure.
Thank you, Truth, for stopping by. I appreciate you, and our beer friend as well. Thanks for being here. Have you all had anything to add?
I had a bunch of different shit to add at so many different stages. I didn't know when to interject or anything. Especially because it was hard without a cam to like wait. So I was like, because I don't want to take it too far back. I would just say, based off like a lot of different stuff that's been said, well, I don't want to repeat things that have already been said, but just it's to me it's silly to even compare the prejudices that white and black people suffer. Like obviously, there's racial bias and a history of systemic issues behind the issues black people face. And so it's just like whenever we talk about these things, they're not really, they're like superficial issues for white people. They're not actual issues. So it's almost like a game of vanity where their like feelings are being appeased. Versus when we discuss black issues, we're talking about real world causal issues that have life and death, and even just altering degrees of different layers of effects in so many different areas that you have to fucking have a whole academia on.
You think? So I want to maybe I didn't hear you correctly. I want to make sure I have. Are you saying that the issues that white individuals are talking about is just a vanity, like when they say like they're facing struggles, that's vanity compared to black issues, which are worthy of academic, inquiry?
Well, as far as it's concerned, racially, like even the idea, like okay, so white pride is racist because white is a race and it's not an ethnicity. Like if someone said, "Oh, I want to be proud of being Italian," that's not the white race. That's not the white race. The black race is no, literally, it's not. Even so, the Aryan race was this belief that if you go to quotes from Julius Caesar, he's asked, "Hey, why don't you go conquer what we now know as like Germany and France, etc." He said, "There's nothing but barbarians up there." Like he didn't even look at them as humans. Versus now, fast forward, Nazis didn't look at Italians as white enough. It's like the white race was really just a creation of anti-black. But interracially, they are ethnically racist as fuck.
Okay.
English people are racist again. racist.
Okay,
ethnically.
What the fuck are you talking about? Like, what are you smoking?
Let me help Truth, because
Can I do it? Can I do it?
Easy fix.
No, no,
Easy fix.
okay.
Easy clap. Easy call. No, easy clap. Why
Stop,
was
stop,
JFK
stop,
because
stop,
you're
stop.
being historically incorrect here.
Irish president?
Oh, sorry.
Hold on, real
Repeat
quick.
what was your point,
No,
Truth?
to their rebuff. If this isn't true, why was JFK on national television asked, "Is America ready for an Irish president?"
So to give
Again, so no, just look. You're wrong.
Yeah.
I'm right. I'm not going to explain it to you.
I want to help Truth.
Let me finish my point. That's why I'm saying that.
I got you.
This is ridiculous. My point is this: the white people have their own intercommunities. They became united. That's what white pride is. They became united in hate towards black people. They said, "Hey, I know we used to bicker about English, Irish, French, Italian. I know we used to do that, but fuck these niggers." Sorry. Oh my God.
That's fine. Don't worry about it.
Fuck these black people so much that we're all gonna unify. And so I'm like, to act as if there's a white race. There's no white race. There's no white pride. That doesn't even make sense. When has that historically happened? When was it? Where's the white race? You tell me, because all I see is a bunch of nation states and ethnicity. What are you talking about? That's why the scientific community doesn't even recognize race. Race only matters for Black Americans. It doesn't even matter for like almost anyone else, unless they've been racially oppressed. Then it matters to them. Like it matters to the racially oppressed because we didn't call ourselves black. We didn't start looking at it, "Hey, you're black." No. So we didn't. The Constitution, when it says black people can't do this, and that in the beginning, that's why race matters. So when you turn around and say, "Oh, can white people have white pride?" Look, no one cares if you want to be proud of being Irish. No one cares if you want to be proud of being Italian. No one's ever cared. I've never in my life heard a single fucking person care about that. Not one fucking time. I've never heard someone go, "Yeah, I fucking love being Italian," and someone's like, "That's pretty fucking uncomfortable." No one's ever said that. But if you say, "I'm proud of being white," yeah, we're all uncomfortable because what the fuck does that even mean? What do you mean? What are you saying? White only exists in racist oppression to black. Otherwise, you're French, you're Irish, you're Italian, you're English, you're British, you're Bulgarian, something. Russians are hated by. I'm just saying, imagine putting a Russian next to a Norwegian, next to a Swede, next to an Englishman, and saying the white race. It's like you live in a fantasy, and that's also an American phenomenon. No one else thinks like this in the rest of the world. And
So
rant over.
to simplify your point a little bit, you're saying that because white people are societally created America, like just like overwhelmingly, there's overwhelming evidence that white people, or really we'll say colonizers, needed to create something so that they were to maintain power and control. So then what they did was that they created skin tone to create those differences. And then because of that normalization, they were allowed to not only detach themselves from their ethnicities, but to attach what is even described to be on the top. So over time, what white culture ended up being is just culture and what normal is. And with that normalization, then you don't really have white culture, because the cultures of the groups underneath them were used to describe the difference or the counter of what the popular culture was. In this case, is the hegemonic norm. Is that like a fair way of describing what you just said?
Yeah.
Yes, that was
That's
perfect.
fair.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so let
Drew,
me
Yeah,
let me like
I
let me
wanna,
go against what you
oh man.
I want to. Dan has been trying to get in for a while, so I want to get Dan in, and then we'll
Yeah.
don't worry, we'll go
Yeah,
to Interceptor, then die. Gary.
My only issue is the Roman part. I actually understand your entire point, Truth. I'm not trying to deny that. The point that you mentioned about Julius Caesar and the Romans viewed barbarians through like race, didn't view anything like as a like ethnicity or race. They viewed everything through culture and
It
by
was all
their
Roman.
standards of their time. They didn't care about your skin color at all. There was like literally like famous Roman emperors who were completely African. Where like, and even there's some that were even famous names like Philip the Arab.
Dan, you're a history guy. You remember what happened to the History Channel when they talked about Black Romans? Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, white people just like, what? There were no Black Romans, and then like, actually there were.
Yeah. I believe his name was.
That video I think
know
is still up on
there's
YouTube
two,
too.
There's like two of them. One of it, and I think he was very famous for Severus. Yeah, Severus was his name. Septus Severus. He was the and Philip the Arab was the other one. The point for much, I understand to get the point entirely, because a lot of races always bring back to like a bunch of the Romans talking about their true heritage is because you're great barbarians, like through like pieces of their history through that. But really, the Romans, they didn't care about your skin color or race in general. They cared about culture superiority. Like they would be more angry at anybody if they have like a white guy wearing just pants than to some person who's Middle Eastern who's wearing a toga. They think that one guy with wearing a toga is Roman. So
yeah,
that's the point I'm trying to say.
I'm really curious. What do people think like
oh man,
my race is?
You're white.
Okay.
Who said that?
What do you,
Hold on.
Whatever race the actor that looks like
Gary.
Jon Snow is.
Gary?
Yeah.
Let me zoom in. Race,
Probably
yeah,
Mexican.
you're racially
That's my guess. My guess is
racially
Mexican.
white, but you're definitely ethnically not like the standard Irish something or English something.
Interesting. I'm actually a second gen immigrant. My family is all from Iran.
Okay,
and I don't
cool.
know. I don't know if typical Persian citizens you'd consider white or not, but there's a very interesting phenomenon that I had growing up. Quick anecdote is that it seems like I'm Middle Eastern when it's time for, if there's like a peak of Middle Eastern racism, which I mean I also know if I look it, but I'm in my 30s. And so I had, plenty of people tell me like, hey, you should go back to your country, terrorist, et cetera, et cetera. And that was something that I had growing up. And even in the military, I experienced some racism from non-commissioned officers where they're like, the people that have been to Afghanistan, et cetera, that see me and they see my name, my last name, which is, I'll just say it's very Middle Eastern sounding. And so they have a reaction to it. However, I mean, typically, and my experience growing up has not been that one of like my father or my grandfather, Baba Jun. And that experience growing up is part of my society. I don't know Farsi. My father knew 4 languages. I don't have his experience growing up, so he would be like maybe like pretty distinct compared to myself. And so I bring this up because you're talking about whiteness as something that's like people opt into, and
Yes.
I want to make it very like clear that's not the case. And in a way, I'm glad that there is an all white everything panel. I was really curious how it's going to turn out, because people grow up, they get ascribed whiteness. As soon as they're born, the whiteness before they're born whiteness. They fill out paperwork for university. You know, you pick your race, you pick white, whatever. And you know, that's a very American thing, which is another thing I'm glad that you brought up. Like, there's a difference between how these identities works across countries, and so. But like in another country, I would be considered Asian or Middle Eastern. I would be specifically not white. And so it's something that we got to keep in mind, that like, even the idea in this chat room and on Twitch is that idea of whiteness is like geographically also connected to the term, and to how fluid it is, and how we shouldn't have a very concrete definition in all cases, and especially the individual.
So let me ask you this, just to make sure where you're at, because I hear your rhetoric and it's the same shit I've been hearing. You
Sure.
connect whiteness with white identity. Is that a fair assessment of what you just said?
Generally, I mean, I'm aware
Sure.
of like kind of like some
Sure.
academic.
Then what would you describe the practices, policies, and procedures that produce white privilege?
That produce white privilege.
Yeah.
I mean,
What would you describe the practices, policies, and procedures that produce white privilege? What would you give that as a definition?
just to like relabel it, or I don't understand like the point.
I'm asking like what, so whiteness is defined clearly as the practices, policies, and procedures that produce white privilege.
No, that's not clear, and that's my point.
Incredibly clear. That goes all the way back from James Baldwin. It gets reinforced by whiteness study
The
scholars.
reason, I'll tell you why it's not clear. So if you look at studies that you would probably heavily disagree with, maybe some of the nature of it, is that white people feel like they've been more discriminated against as of recently. Like there's been since like 2012, 7, 12, and 19 are just studies that I looked at, like kind of increasing over time. Then a meta study analyzing those, which I retroactively read. And to just dismiss that increase as just fantasy or something that doesn't exist is missing the forest for the trees. That these people have an identity, and they don't understand the academic terms and that you're ascribing to them. And so I believe everything you said is correct as far as the implications of whiteness and white privilege. Those things are all true. But at the same time, those are systematic issues that you're describing accurately, whereas the individual will have a different experience with those terms. So much so that on a society-wide basis, when they hear white, they don't necessarily think of everything that you described. They think of just themselves or their family.
Correct. That's why the right wing made it very clear that to make that part of the conversation. Like, this is phenomenon that has been analyzed and established within the Black community since the early 1900s. And whiteness is, again, clearly defined and reinforced as the practices, procedures, and policies that produce white privilege. Even whiteness studies openly acknowledges in that practice, which is a part of college academia, of the analysis of procedures, policies, practices, all of those things that produce white privilege. However, the problem is, and you correctly identified, that white privilege is the social prioritization of the expectations, needs, wants, and desires of white people. Now,
yeah, honestly, that label, like the whole whiteness thing, that should be reworded, which is what I was saying before.
Sure,
because
but
when
let me expand on it a bit more, because I'm not. I was going
to give me 7 seconds. So
Sure.
I would say that a person from a backwater of Georgia that has to go fill out their license and put down their race at one of 5 options in the country, and they put down white. I don't know if they are thinking everything you're thinking.
That was the point that I laid out earlier in terms of CRT. That the issue at hand is that Black, I'm going to be very distinct here, I don't know if Truth is still here, but the studies and analysis of Black people, particularly Black femmes, but more broadly Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, people of color, when they talk about these phenomena that they live under in these systems of oppression, these terms and words, once they reach the hegemonic majority, get whitewashed and normalized in a way. It has a way to justify not having those conversations. And even Joe Fagan describes this in his book, The White Racial Frame. in that because white people, specifically colonizers, but broadly white people, have done disgusting atrocities to indigenous folks, black folks, women, people of color, and all the in between, including European ethnic minorities, they needed a framing and understanding to justify that violence. So what the white racial frame does is that it normalizes and justifies that behavior, and using that lens, obfuscate the conversations away from those truths. So what you'll hear is, when I talk about whiteness as the procedures, practices, and policies that produce white privilege, and then I talk about white privilege being the social prioritization of those expectations, needs, wants, and desires of white people, and that it's separate from white identity, which is just the objective state of perceiving oneself as white and others relating that, then things get kind of weird, because then the conversation isn't about, okay, well, what are the practices, procedures, and policies that produce the societal prioritization? The conversation then becomes, well, I don't really like the word here, because when we get to the layman, we can't get people on board with this layman thing. So we should probably change the word first before we talk about these things. When I talk about these things, I don't even use the words anymore, because it's at this point where when we have these conversations, people will not, like, I can lay out all these things like whiteness, white privilege, and white identity distinctly without using the word, and people will be on board with that. But the minute I use whiteness or white privilege or white identity, then the conversation gets obfuscated.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? So why even do that then? If your goal is to educate, if your goal is to outline issues, then why not just use the thing that you know won't obfuscate the
Because the
conversation?
right simultaneously understands that as well. So what happens is that when we don't use the words, white people will and have and still do say, well, they're not using this word here, but what they actually mean is this. They don't mean racial equity here. What they mean is to racially separate people and make opposition that tells the difference between white and black. So it's just using divisive language without using the definitions.
I'll be straight with you is that there's a very small portion of the country that understands this term like you do.
And there's a very large portion of the country that is actively looking to restrict history education and broadly not only LGBTQ plus education, but gender affirmation, as well as racial equity in the school system and broadly in the United States. And the right has used this as their 2021 rallying call. So I'm telling you that even when we get rid of the words and just use the describing of the phenomena, they're already ahead of us on that. They're already understanding that we're not going to use the words when we talk to these folks.
Being white is ingrained in society such that if you try to redefine that whiteness means all the oppression, etc. for it, and it means the exact same thing as the way people identify, these two are synonymous with each other, then that is where you're going to face your issues.
So
do you not see?
I want to let in a few other people here. So I want to let in Rage. Then I want to let in the new people who came in, because they all each have something different they want to address. So I want to make sure they have space. So, but Rage first.
Okay. There's been a lot. We're past the part that I wanted to jump in initially, but there's been multiple points that I wanted to jump in recently. Joe Lewis, what you're saying about the definitions in academic sense that's true. Like you can look up online, or anybody can look it up online. However, there definitely probably are Republicans who are doing what you are saying they are doing, but I also know there's tons of Republicans who they aren't. They're not. They aren't using this. Like, they are trying to block things, but they're trying to block things that they don't understand. They're not trying to block it because they're playing like this three-dimensional chess where they know that this, like, they're using dog whistles to shape the words into. I don't know if every single right-leaning, commentator or pundit or Republican or whatever is doing this thing. So I think making that the argument is making more enemies than we actually need. I think we would have more success if we didn't use language that I guess is confusing to a lot of people. Like, if we recognize that the language is messed up right now. Like we live in a world where everybody is disagreeing on what normal language is. Like language is breaking down. The weird thing is I'm not accusing you specifically, but you're highlighting the fact that there are Republicans who are like twisting words to like mean different things. And then they're saying the exact same thing to like their people. And like so we're all thinking that we're all whistling about different things. Like nobody can have an actual communication like that.
Right, and that's my point here, right? So like let me just lay this down kind of distinctly. Do you think that teachers should teach that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex?
No.
Yes or no?
No.
No, right? Yes. Well, it's in the law in 9 states that you're not allowed to do that. Do you think an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, oppressist, or whether consciously or unconsciously? Like, do you think that like do you believe that?
I don't. Can you repeat?
Yeah, like an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, or the contrary.
Like,
yeah, well,
I personally don't believe that.
9 states ban that. So in education and public schools, do you think that by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility for the actions committed by other members of that same race or sex? Like, do you think that should be taught in public schools?
I don't believe that should be taught in public schools.
Right. 9 states have that banned. And what's funny about this, which is why I bring it up, in the vast majority, again, there's 30 states that have laws restricting what I'm describing here.
Wait, but is there a problem with that being banned?
I don't have an issue of that being banned. The problem here is that they're using critical race theory, gender affirmation, and equity education as that cudgel. And
Like,
they're actively
if they're
doing
banning those things, and then they extend that to say we can't have like deep analysis of like the racial politics and history in America, then we have a problem. But if they're banning specifically that you can't teach kids that you're inherently racist, I don't necessarily have a problem with that part.
Right,
Like,
and nobody does. Like those things that they're restricting are of courses. That doesn't even happen in public schools anyway.
Well,
however, they're using this as the first step to make additional legislation.
There are anecdotes where they can point to like
those are
one-off.
Yeah, and they use those. And they're using those anecdotes to justify this legislation in 30 states, a vast majority of which have Republican state legislatures. Which is my point.
Literally the same. What I think Joe's getting to is this literally the same argument they use against trans kids, right? Like, well, I mean, what we do is actually just hate trans kids. We hate trans individuals. And so we'll point to some vague anecdote, right? And most of them use the same ones. Like across all these states, they'll use like the same few anecdotes about trans athletes doing something, maybe in trans sports, like excelling, maybe. And then that's the reason. And because of they can excel, that it's unfair. And so we should stop it. However, to Joe's point, right? Like, is that actually happening? If you ask them, oh, like, are there trans students, right? Like, what trans students, trans athletes are in your state, excelling, winning these championships? They're like, oh, I can't think of any. I actually have no idea. It's
even when they're approached
I think on that example real quick that you're talking about, like, I feel like the two sides that talk about this are talking about, like, I don't want to get too much into it, but they're like, they look at it in 2 entirely different spectrums. The people on the right, when they hear like a trans athlete, they think about somebody who's like, let's say like a basketball player. They say like, now I'm a female, like now I'm trans, legitimately, but then like barring them to compete like immediately, right? But in their eyes, they're envisioning them competing immediately. While on the left, we think like, no, they're gonna go through their entire transition, and they're gonna be like, a time frame is gonna pass. That's why those two conversations don't work. I don't think I've ran into many like right-leaning individuals that like, once you like, hold on, what if there is the timeline that needs to be expressed? Because even people on the left believe that. Right, there's no way in hell someone's gonna think that like a varsity level, D1 level college lacrosse player is immediately going to be allowed to transition to female.
Well, they're using, but against also they're using that as their justification to create this legislation. That very idea of a varsity, like what you just described, is rhetoric that's used in Texas, Florida, Georgia, Virginia, and I think Montana as a way of justifying this legislation to exist. one for one. Like I'm not even trying to like be hyperbolic here. Like it's in the council meetings, it's in the board of education meetings where, and the thing is, which is again, I called out Sprouticus on this because he was being hypocritical, is that it's explicitly designed to target trans women. Period.
Okay,
it's
can
not even
we-
legislation that's designed to target trans people broadly. It's just trans women. Where like if you and the laws aren't even in some cases trying to hide that it's explicitly designed to target trans women. Some are like the Save Women and the Save Girls in Sports Act or the Protect Girls in Sports Act.
So
It's like,
sure, because they feel like that's
why-
probably where like
the-
like where like the quote unquote, I don't like using the word damage, but like in their vision, like in their mind, like that's probably where it's going to be held. Like is men transitioning to women, not like women
So-
transitioning to men, right?
Yeah,
I don't want
they
to
would
get too
say
far
that-
away from.
but again, like the question remains is if we're looking to, and this is why like I don't know if Peacecraft is still around, but something that Peacecraft was really good about is about being consistent. And consistently, as a right winger, if you're making this legislation and using this rhetoric, you would have to then also make restrictions for trans men. But they don't do that. And then even when you acknowledge that, like, hey, like your bill explicitly discriminates against trans women and trans men are omitted, and in some cases, trans men are even allowed to compete in those sports, despite the fact that trans women are getting restricted. And you go, well, why is that? Like, why do you have this exception to trans men? And then they will do this like medical essentialism of saying that like, well, boys are just different because of testosterone in science. Like, don't you trust the science? And that like when you have testosterone, like you're gonna be totally different. But if you're a woman here, like because of the testosterone, you never lose that testosterone in your body, which is why we're restricting against women. And I wish like I was just saying things as like hyperbole. Like this is the rhetoric. Like
So I don't. So again, I don't want to get too far into this. I want Rage to be able to respond. I do want to go to the new people who came in here. But Rage, you can respond. The point is that like these things are just used as cudgels, right, to get across discriminatory or damaging legislation. So like Rage respond, and then I'm going to go to the new people.
I don't really want to go into the trans sports issue because I don't really want to have that because I don't
Just
know.
all
I
right,
don't
go
have
ahead. Just
details
go
on
ahead.
that.
Just go ahead.
But the one with banning critical race theory, like I think we need to get the public to understand what critical race theory is, but we live in two different realities. Like Republicans have different news and different people they follow and different social media like pipelines and whatnot. So like if since we can't communicate to them that this is actually what we mean, we don't mean that thing. Using that term that's already been the term's basically been, I don't want to say corrupted, but I don't think it's a useful term. So we have to change. We have to shift if we want if we want to win.
Yeah, and I agree with that, which is why I was really excited about Joe Biden creating an initiative alongside, and the NEA is doing it too, about changing the rhetoric around critical race theory and showing what it's all about. But then when Jen Psaki was asked about it directly, she said that the Biden administration is moving away from that program altogether. And what's funny about that is that the right wing did a very conscious and dedicated media effort in those states where legislation against CRT is on the table to tell people to call their Congress members. So like right around the same rhetoric, like when Joe Biden announced that, the rhetoric of certain politicians, including Tom Carton, Marjorie Taylor Greene, what's his face in the governor of Florida, like their rhetoric around that changed to go against that. But then when you look at the state level, right, they were literally doing counter campaigns just to an announcement of an initiative, so much so that the White House was able to back away from it.
So I want to learn some new people here. I know you guys may have come in for like different points we've lined with past, but I want to make sure you guys are included. Or if you have a new point you want to jump in on, that's fine. Let's start with what's it? Nosher? I'm sorry, G Master H2O. Hey, hi, hello.
Hi, hello.
Nice to meet you.
This point has kind of been passed for a while, but I guess I'll bring it back to it. I just want to bring up the efficacy of shaming a Karen versus like being kind and extending an olive branch. And I think that the efficacy of shame is like highly contextual. So first I want to clarify what I mean when I say Karen, because it is a fluid term. I mean a white woman, usually in middle age, who weaponizes her position of privilege, specifically against minorities. So I'm talking like the lady who calls the cops on Black people in the park. And I think that shaming is an effective tool against this specific context because we're not going to change a 60-year-old racist woman. You're probably not even going to be able to convince her that what she's doing is racist. And what's so much more effective is shaming the behavior and creating an environment that discourages her children or her grandchildren or people who are younger that aren't set in their racist ways to not grow up to be a Karen. We want to address the environment that allowed her to grow up to be like that. And so to say we shouldn't ostracize people because it pushes them further right is valuing the education and the feelings of the oppressor over the actual physical safety of marginalized communities.
Thank you for that.
Well said.
Makes sense.
That was all.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good way. Okay, so first of all, was it a G Master? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
That's a better entrance than most people get here, right? Like, oh, everything you said makes sense. That usually doesn't happen here. It's usually like, this person's a fool, get them off. So it's a good start to being on this panel. Thank you so much for that. If anyone wants to comment on that, let me know.
Sorry to like bring up an old topic.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We made you wait a while. Rage, do you have a direct response to that? Or Interceptor too?
I'm still gonna push back on the valuing the opinions and feelings of the oppressed, like that individual, like that specific racist person. Like I don't care about their feelings, but like and I also still agree there's utility in social ostracization of like really inappropriate behaviors, like the calling people when there's no reason to call the police on the people. However, pushing people further right and further dividing this country, there is an argument to be had there, and we do have to be careful that we don't keep polarizing until we end up having people literally just killing more, until we get more damage in the streets. We don't want to polarize
But
that
are
far.
Black people causing that polarization? So
I think everybody's causing that polarization.
Okay, so I mean,
you can't don't cop out on that, Riz. Come on, man. You got to be very like you got to be or whoever said that. You got to be distinct. Like when you're describing these things, like you got to make it clear. How are Black people doing this? We'll start there.
Well, we don't even gotta do the Socratic method. I'm like, look, this is that's propaganda. That's like fucking propaganda. Like, look, it's not narrative to say that there is a direct effort among certain white individuals politically to belittle and diminish the effect of racism and the necessity of race-based conversation. Period. Like they don't want to discuss.
I agree with that, but that's not what I'm talking about.
Trying to combat one
When
extreme
you say that, so when
another
you say that,
kind of extremity usually doesn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. So when you say that, oh, hey, like, oh, you're kind of doing a false equivalency. You're acting as if like whatever Black people or other minorities might be doing to the conversation in that regard, that it's equal to like the actual. How do I put it?
I don't believe I said they were
Whatever
equal.
negative side effects are coming from the race conversation are not up to Black people to mitigate. Like honestly, like that's ridiculous. Even saying
I'm not talking about the race conversation though. I'm specifically talking about polarization where we call people like calling people fascists even though they're just a normal Republican, or calling people stupid, or calling people half the country. Like when you go to that extreme, when you demonize the other side. I'm not saying we should of course have realistic conversations about race, and that everywhere, and everybody needs to be involved in those. I'm not saying that we can't talk about race because it's going to make people far right. That would be ridiculous. What I'm saying is the demonization part. That part we have to watch, because you can push people further right, and that is bad for everybody.
Yeah.
So, Rage, I have a question for you.
One last point.
I agree. I totally agree with that sentiment. That being said, I don't think Karen's a good example of that. I think Karen has actually, in the funniest of ways, done a lot to promote like the awareness of like this phenomenon. Like the fact that it's a meme, it's a joke, everyone can relate to it, and yet it's a real thing that now everyone can notice.
So I want G Master to be able to respond, and then Inferno, Quill.
I had a question for you, Rage. Do you think that it's possible to create an environment where it's uncomfortable as fuck to be a Karen, be like weaponize someone's position as a white woman in society against minorities? To be as
Yeah.
uncomfortable as fuck to do it without pushing them farther right.
Yes. I may have not been very clear. I don't think Karen is the like ostracizing that behavior is where we're like radicalizing people. Not we wouldn't be the ones radicalizing, but where it leads to the radicalization of people. I don't think that's the issue. I was just specifically pointing to the last part of your comment where you said you did. I don't know if you said you didn't care, but you said we shouldn't be prioritizing the like feelings and condition of the oppressor over like the people who are being oppressed. Um, and that we shouldn't care about or not care. I'm mixing up my words, but we shouldn't put so much emphasis on being afraid of pushing people far right. I do think we should
Well, I just don't
rein
even
that in.
I don't even think that the act of shaming a Karen is going to push her further right.
Right,
I'm not
not a
convinced
Karen.
of that.
Not a Karen. I think in other instances that
Yeah.
we should be worried about demonizing people and pushing them to be more unreachable and bad.
Yeah. Like I said, it's highly contextual, and that's why I like clarified what I meant by Karen.
Okay.
I think to the question, it's like most of these people are unredeemable and they're never gonna come over to our side anyway. So we just
I
gotta
don't
be
think
able
that's
to
true. I don't think there are irredeemable people, but I don't think most of the people who are politically in opposition to left wing views are irredeemable.
No, I'm
I
not
don't
talking
think
about that. I'm talking about someone you could effectively, truthfully call a Karen. Lost cause. Lost cause. And even if they did switch, to what event? What do we get out of that? Like we get.
What do you mean? You don't get elections that are
Like
so
that's
close.
the whole point, right?
I wanna
Like if you
see.
switch them,
No,
as what is
there
being
are not
marginalized,
enough
and it's the
Karens
same
to
point.
sway an election, right? And also,
No,
if
you
try
are.
to
Middle-aged white
You're
women? You don't
sadly
think there's enough
mistaken.
middle-aged white women to
No,
swing
no,
elections?
no, you're
In
gonna
fact,
sound racist.
in
Don't
fact,
just say, "Oh, but a Karen is a large demographic of society." No, but anyway, so you're
middle-aged
not gonna
white
win an
suburban
election
women
based off
are
of a
a
Karen.
huge
You're
topic
not
and a
gonna.
huge demographic in society.
You're not
Have
gonna win an
the
election based real fast. You're not gonna win an election based off of Karen, and those are gonna be wasted resources anyway, right?
Well, if you've
Once
defined Karen to basically be middle-aged white women, that's a large voting block.
Right.
But
you could argue.
but we're not defining Karen as middle-aged
We're
white
defining
woman.
it
You
strictly
are.
as what Game Master defined it as.
Well, hey, Quill, what do you want to say? Quill, go ahead.
argue-
Hold on, Quill, what do you want to say?
Thank-
What did you say?
You could
I'm
argue
saying
that you could win
Uh, uh.
over anyone at some point or time, but it's about a level. It's a hierarchy of effectiveness and pragmatism.
Quill.
Realistically, Karens are at the bottom of the totem pole of people you're going to win over, and they're useless when they don't have a large network of people who follow. Like no one fucks with Karens. Like if you understand how Karens are temperamentally, the reason you can even notice them in public is because of their negativity. So it's not just the racism; it's also overlaid with all this other personality traits. It's like they're useless to any movement. It doesn't even make sense.
Sorry.
It's like saying, "Oh, we need to get the leader of the KKK to join us." No,
Okay,
giving
sorry.
him the
I want
switch
to let
make
Quill
it-
in. Quill, go ahead.
All right, so you just mentioned that you might be able to notice a Karen based off her characteristics, and that inherently gets rid of the idea that a Karen can be described as all middle-aged white women, right? And so based off the idea of Karen, we were talking about how Karen is very fluid. We were talking about how the conversation wasn't that efficient because it's so fluid, and now we're going with the definition of a Karen who uses her privilege to enforce some sort of discrimination upon a minority. Now, if we're going with that definition specifically, then I just lost my whole train of thought. What were we talking about previously? Karen's. What was Rage's position on? Oh, okay. So the idea that it's worth it to actually try to appeal to a Karen, specifically somebody that is like outraged in society, pushing back against the minority, discriminatorily going crazy, screaming like the person who calls the cops on minorities or black people in the park, right? Trying to reason person because if you don't reason with them and you try to call them a Karen and try to call them names in society to try to give them backlash, the idea that you shouldn't give them backlash because there might be a chance that you calling them that pushes some people farther right just doesn't make sense. Like
I don't
the
I
chance.
don't think
Exactly, because the truth
I
is,
don't
look,
think people are saying don't give these individuals backlash, right? I think it's the methodology on the way that you're choosing to give them backlash, which is the difference, right? So when you have somebody, for example, like the whole Karen thing, at least in my mind, when we're having someone freaking out and she's fulfilling the definition of Karen or the more or less one that we established, right? And she's freaking out and she's freaking out and she's freaking out, and everybody's like, you Karen, like aggressively attacking her and being very antagonistic to her, even though she's being antagonistic to whatever person of like the target of her anger, right? That is the type of response where it's going to get pushed. And in my opinion, is going to push somebody more entrenched, right? She's not going to change her opinion to be of the opinions that are or the people that are assaulting or attacking her. But if you were to like ostracize, like if you were to do it in a, like, for example, if you do it in an entirely different way, where you completely ignore the woman for one case, right? Or if somebody does come up and they talk to him like literally real calm and simple and like a child, right? And to bring down the situation, to give them a little chance to get them to have a little bit of self-reflection, which does occur. We're all human beings now, right? It's like, I think that is a type of like methodology, at least I know myself, that I'm pushing for, because like aggressively attacking somebody, you're not going to get them to change. Like,
So
if I start
yeah,
calling
so
you
I
an
think
idiot or I
I
start
have a
calling you a
I have a
fool,
question
you're
though,
never going to agree
Salsa.
with me any topic.
I've been trying to.
Let me just
I
respond
got.
to
I
this
got
really
this
quickly,
because
please.
this is important. If we're arguing
Sorry.
the logistics of a war of ideas, right?
So-
The if you're at, you have antagonists, you have protagonists, you have individuals who are on the fence, you have advocates. You're not going to spend your time even considering that person, because even if you said there is a chance they will switch, there's a bunch of people who might switch, and you're one person with one certain amount of energy and people and blah blah blah, and you don't. Now, as far as a movement efficacy, if you're talking about like, oh, are we turning off the bystanders who might relate to this person? They were already turned off by everything you said. You were never going to get this person in this moment. Like in the moment that someone is behaving in a toxic, negative way, that was never going to be some catalyst for them reflecting on their own negativity because you handle it positive.
So
I don't like. I guess maybe maybe.
So hold on, sorry, I got sorry, I do. Hold on, I got. So hold on, stop. Thank you, great. I got a lot of people who want to jump in and talk. All right. So I'm trying to balance all this. All right. Cool. I want you to be able to finish your point. Then I'm going to go to G Master, and then I'm going to go to Joe. But then I want to get in the last two individuals who were brand new, who didn't get a chance to say anything. All right. So Quill.
Okay, so just to respond to Salsa's point, so basically, when you the ostracize, I don't know how to pronounce that word. You know what I'm talking about. The aggressive attack, right? Do you think that it is worth it to hold back that aggressive attack because that aggressive attack might influence other people to go even more radically right? Like, because if you try to appeal to them, you're basically doing nothing in the very specific situation of the Karen we've described. That person, if we try to appeal to them, that you're not going to go anywhere like 99 times out of 100. So I feel like we, at least if you try to aggressively attack them, there might be a higher chance of them realizing their wrongdoings rather than trying to appeal to a person that we know is like most likely not going to change their values or views.
And just real quick, and I guess that's where we disagree on like how like valuable that is, right? Like I'm willing to say like attacking somebody, I don't think anybody's really going to change their opinion on them when you start attacking them for that, right? I feel like the Karen's going to stay entrenched, as opposed to if I were to calm down and I would talk to her as like a normal human being. I think I'm more likely for her to get her on my side. There's a very strong possibility it's not going to work. I agree with her. It's not going to be effective for everybody, right? But I do think that's going to be, if we're going to try to see results of trying to move somebody over there, like being nice to them is going to do a lot more than being aggressive to them. That's
You think even though, so just one last sentence, even though they're that radical, you still think appealing to them would be the
like
more
if they are the Trump flag waving everything and I got Trump 2024 type shit and blah blah blah, like Joe Biden was sworn, if they wear that stuff, no, I don't think you're going to change them at all, right? But if it's somebody who's just like going on, she feels like her individual rights were violated for whatever reason, how silly it may be or whatever, but it's not like anything. I think 100% you can probably talk to those individuals.
You'll appeal to them. Okay, that's fair.
Okay, so you can't reason with unreasonable people just in general. And no one's advocating to aggressively attack anyone. I'm saying like videotape them and post them and shame her on Facebook. And so because you can't reason with unreasonable people, it's really a waste of your energy to try to like extend an olive branch to the Karen at the park. what's going to be a lot more effective is intervening at a young age to someone who's not 60 years old and been this way for decades. That's why things like CRT are important, because like younger folks are a lot more malleable and able to be influenced. And so if someone's raised in a place where being a Karen is shamed, they're a lot less likely to do that. And then my final point, some people in the chat were saying like don't use gendered insults in general, and like I think overall that's probably a good guideline, but I do think that the word Karen is important because it highlights the unique role that white women have in racism and like institutionalized racism. White women's emotions are garner a lot of sympathy from white men more than like another white man, and white women have a very specific role that like should be distinguished.
Agreed. Let's go to Joe.
Yeah, and to even reinforce that, right? Like, and I don't think Salsa disagrees with this, right? Because we had a situation. This man's name is Edward Cagney Matthews, who went on this really racist rant in front of members of his community in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and openly within the video, which I'm going to put in chat, he called his neighbors the N-word and monkeys, and N-word monkeys too. He put them together. It was great. And within that video, he spit in a man's face. And then, like, in the video, he says, if you have a problem with me, come find me. And he listed his address. And then the community showed up for it during his arrest. And the crowd functioned in an illogical manner. And something that happened from New Jersey 101.5 all the way to a bunch of op-eds in NewJersey.com, people were arguing in the guise of free speech. And this is what I was talking about when I talked about the white racial frame. And that in the face of illogical racism to Black Americans, white people, predominantly white people, found a way to justify and normalize the behavior. So instead of the conversation being about the words that they said and the actions that they did to another member of their community, the conversation was about, well, if it's free speech, then why is he getting charged for things? He shouldn't be charged for a crime. Like, it's illogical. Like, literally, a reporter, like, what do they call it? A commentator on New Jersey 101.5, one of the most listened news stations in my state, said that the man shouldn't be charged because of free speech. And that was his argument to his audience. And then, like, I'm listening to this. It's like, are you fucking kidding me? That's like,
what was he
He
charged
fucking
with?
spit on him.
He
That's
spit-
crazy.
yeah, and again, like, and the thing was is that, like, what happens is, and what the white racial frame does as another sort of thing, is that it gaslights minorities into, like, not even, like, thinking that we're seeing the same reality. Like, I saw a video of a white man calling Black people monkeys and N-word monkeys and spitting in their face and saying, like, these ridiculous slurs. And then in the response to the community, when he did an act to violence, saying that, hey, if you have a problem with me, come find me. That to me is asking for some type of confrontation. And I'd be curious to see someone who would say otherwise. And then when the community shows up with the same energy that he's putting out, then all of a sudden it's like, well, this BLM, they just came in here, they didn't live in the community anyway. And then, like, they should have, like, the officer should have been way more hostile to these protesters of this man. He's just exercising his right to free speech. Like, these things are really, really, really invasive. And that's it's always been my concern.
Yeah, I think that's sort of.
Trump was acting like his goddamn best friend. He was like, "Hey, come on, Frank, knock it out." Like,
what's crazy is that the officer,
he was another cops. They knew each other, didn't they?
The responding officer knew of this man,
right?
So, like, he addressed the officer by his last name, and he said, "White, what are you doing here?" In the video, when he openly said, "I'm calling 911." So then like a white, and then him as a white man approached the white officer saying, "White, what are you doing here?" And then just starts walking towards him. And then the officer's like, "No, wait, hang on, like, you're getting too close." In many other situations we've seen time and time again where somebody who is clearly belligerent to other neighbors, walking over to a police officer in a hostile manner is basically saying, "I would like to be on the ground now, please. Not later, but right now." And that's something of concern. And, like, this is, like, again, like, it's cool that we understand, like, these things are not good.
All right, let's hit up. I just want to move things along. All right, so we're gonna hit the two new people. We haven't got a chance to talk at all. We have sorry, looking at the names. Manbeard and Sinister Yogi. Then we can jump back to the rest of everyone else. So Manbeard.
Yeah. So I actually have a lot here to go off of, touching basically on everything that's here because mainly I kind of represent the group that a lot of you have been discussing, and what I mean is like the people that are not actually speaking up in regard to why they don't like CRT or what the backlash is, and it's because we have this viewpoint of all racism is bad, and by that we mean any decisions that are being made because of someone's race. So when you go forth and you have like critical race theory, where we see in schools people are being grouped up by race, that raises huge concerns. And that so that goes. That's why they're getting up in arms on it. I several times you've discussed
Where?
like policies here. I'm sorry, what was that?
Sorry, go ahead.
So, several times there have been discussions about policies, specifically mentioning back, early 1900s and stuff like that. But our viewpoint is that we've progressively gone towards being less racist the entire time, and in the last decade, racism has become much more of an issue and much more prevalent. Like that's the viewpoint, and that's why everyone like the viewpoint that we're going negative. The viewpoint, several discussions on people are not using the same definitions of words. When you bring in when you talk about they were racist because we're talking about systematic racism, like that's where we view that words are being twisted in that fashion. If you're making decisions on race, it's bad. That's regardless of whether it's trying to put one group over another for something that happened in the past. And that's definitely not saying that any of that things that happened in the past was good, or that we want any of that. It's just that we're now propagating another cycle of racist tendencies because it is driving people to the right. Now those people that were crazy on the fringes are now getting more people because they're losing jobs. Like when we see diversity hire practices where they're only hiring, or they're particularly only looking to hire for a particular race. Either race has an intrinsic value where it's providing some sort of merit and means something, or it doesn't. Up until now, our thing is that it doesn't. Like it does. What the color of your skin does not matter as far as your intelligence or your ability to do a job or anything like that. So now when we're introducing that into the workforce, that's what's causing those major problems. Since I have several things here, like does anyone want to like respond to that?
Yeah, I have a very distinct question here. It's pretty simple. Do you? It's a little bit. So work with me. Do you think men and women have very distinct differences in society?
Like in what way?
I'm just asking, like just broadly. Do you think, broadly speaking, men and women have different experiences with their interactions in society?
It's not a trick question.
It's not a trap.
Well, I mean, there's obviously places that men and women go that the other cannot go. So,
sure.
I mean, in that regard, yes.
Do you think because of these societal differences, it's important to understand how men and women talk about these things amongst each other?
Okay. I think I know where you're going with this, so let me back this up for a second. We're specifically talking about
approach what I'm saying. Don't approach what you think I'm saying.
Okay. But what I'm saying is I'm coming at this from the perspective of our government.
Like, right, and I'm doing that too. I'm doing that too. So again,
but you can have the conversations without the government involved.
No, but you're not answering my question. Do you think that men and women, because of their differences in society, should be able to talk amongst themselves? I'll reword the question. Do you think men and women
absolutely
be able? Sure. So if I am creating a diversity or a sexual diversity exercise And the first part of it is talking about the just seeing how these individuals talk about these things. Would you support a policy or an educational exercise that separates men and women to talk about these things as the first step to understanding these issues?
Is this voluntary? Like
100% voluntary. Education and all these educational things would be voluntary.
Well, I mean, at that point, you're not talking about our school system. So yeah, whoever wants to go do any kind of group can do whatever. They want.
Okay, would you extend that same thing to race?
The people want to talk about race. That's absolutely fine. Like
the
our problem
policy.
is governments making policies.
That's the policy that currently exists that you're actually against, that you worded in your sentence. What happened in the thing that you described earlier was a situation where in the first start of talking about equity and diversity and inclusion in schools, the school board made an optional educational exercise where on one side, on the first half of the information section, it was for persons of color, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. And then the next section was for white kids and white students, I should say directly. This is a totally optional thing, and it was not mandatory. And then what happened was the rhetoric
at a specific school.
Yes, this happened in 3 different states. And then what happened was the rhetoric around that was that schools are segregating students based on their race. And that was the headline, and that's what was shipped. And then when the school board acknowledged that this was an optional exercise that students were able to sign up for, and this also was about creating affinity spaces and safe spaces for these individuals to talk about their experiences with racism in their school system, they ended up having to table it because the dissent was that you ought not to segregate people based on their race. And that was the rhetoric around that.
Okay, so you're still not refuting like what I was saying though, as far as what we should or should not be doing. So are you actually stating that they should be segregating them? That there should be
it's not segregation, right? So I'm in support of affinity spaces so that
when a teacher
marginalized
stands up in front of a class, to borrow like the systematic power examples here, when a teacher stands up in front of a class and tells them that they're wanting kids to volunteer for something, that has weight. Like when those 2 students go home and talk to their parents about it, and they hear about that, that's what's causing these issues.
Right, and these things are optional and separate from the school curriculum, and they're announced in Board of Education meetings first. So why is it that now that they had multiple Board of Education meetings to challenge this, and some of these policies and educational curriculum is public access, and they have access to this upwards of 6 to 8 months? The thing I just described, the school board announced it a year ago. And then once a year ago from 2020, so 2019. And then it wasn't until Chris Rufo acknowledged that schools are segregating students based on their race, despite the fact he didn't say anywhere that it was optional. He didn't say anywhere that it was separate from the school curriculum. He didn't say anywhere that it was separate outside of school hours. So this wasn't something that was within the school day. And then all of a sudden it's like teachers are teaching kids that segregation is okay and that we're separating people based on their skin color.
So your statement here is that all these school systems, none of them are actually requiring critical race theory at all. They are having board meetings to discuss
equity,
school club?
Equity, inclusion, and diversity.
Yeah, I understand you keep saying words, but what I'm saying is now you're telling me that none of that's actually required.
I'm saying that there are people aren't happy. So what's happening in a vast majority of school districts across the United States is that there's an acknowledgement that Black students and persons of color are treated distinctly different, whether it be from the interactions with the teachers all the way down to the student level. So one of the first steps in this inclusion and diversity training, and also cultural sensitivity, is finding out how the students are talking and interacting with each other, and how particularly Black students are interacting and being interacted with. What many school districts found, and the one that caused the problem here was Loudoun County, Virginia, is that Black students self-reported that they experienced discrimination from the students all the way up to the teachers and even the superintendent's office. So what they did was they created a program that, to acknowledging that this was the problem, that Black students and persons of color were reporting negative outcomes because of their race and because of the interactions of the individual racism and then the structural racism of the school. And then they ought to, from level 1, and start from educating teachers about diversity, inclusion, equity, and cultural sensitivity, which at the time did not exist. alongside making sure that students had their opportunities within this educational process of seeing what the teachers are being educated on in terms of cultural sensitivity, open about how the students felt and how the parents felt about this, particularly the Black students. And then from there, that's what it was. It had nothing to do with critical race theory.
So if there's structural racism in this particular school, what was the policy that was being racist?
It was a few things, right? One of the things was that they found that Black students were getting harsher sentences for the equal suspension compared to white students, which is a very common occurrence. Another thing was the lack of just education around the history, not only the history of race, but just Black history generally. And then another thing, which was also very apparent, was the overt racism that existed at the student level. Things as simple as students at all levels of it. Things like students writing N-word on the school bus, which was self-reported, and then even students making TikToks and other levels of harassment
that's not,
towards other Black students. And
well, in particular, that last one. Sorry.
Because this isn't just like it's not just one thing that I'm laying out that's being laid out here.
But you're also not answering policies. You're saying you're giving examples of people being racist.
Right, but the thing is that it's not just policy, my friend. There's policies, practices, and procedures that create these things. Like it's not just a structural thing.
Writing.
No, you're being too polite. That's a cop out. They always want to go to the where is it written down to be racist? No one's going to write down let's be racist. We're going to enforce it.
No, and I didn't say that. I'm specifically asking.
Hold on, real quick. They're gonna enforce it in a racist way, and they're gonna write it in a way that disproportionately affects the target group. That
as an example, right? So if you have a school policy around detentions, and then you find that Black students and students of color disproportionately have received harsher sentences. And when I say sentences, suspensions, additional like in school and out of school, compared to the exact same thing of a white students. What do you think is the policy prescription there? What should happen to that procedure?
More information needs to be gathered. You can't just take that one statistic and then go into it. I mean, you mentioned, I think it was the other day, someone talking about what the 2% of COVID death rates actually means in numbers. What is the actual significance in the statistics? Are we talking 5 people? Are we talking 50? We're talking 100? Like, what is the difference there?
Yeah, and I understand COVID's an easy place to go to, but I want to stay on racism, right? So I laid out through the reporting that reported by students, and then they checked to the actual suspensions. One for one, police were called more often to Black students who got into acts of what they considered violence or what have you at the school compared to the white students. So what that looks like is predominantly when police were called to instances of violent, any type of, well, I'm going to use it to be very clear here, which is violence that results in non-bodily harm. They found that disproportionately, police were called to Black students more than white students. So with that in mind, what do you think should happen with a policy like that? So,
well, like I said, you're still only giving me, like, we still need to go look into that further. You're taking one statistic and not investigating, like, what that statistic is actually meaning. Like, disproportionately, in what regard? Are we talking about 10 instances? Because I don't give a shit. Like, you know what I mean?
We found
it.
Are you actually being good faith here?
Yeah, I have a couple questions for Manbeard here.
Okay, so are you saying that what you're concerned about is the number of reporting? Is that what I'm saying correctly?
No, okay. I'll get. I know you just jumped on me for going to COVID, but I've actually done some research on something else. I'm going to use this as an example. I'm not trying to derail the conversation here.
Sure.
But for statistical purposes, I'm going to mention something.
Sure.
Not related to race.
Sure.
So in like 2020 or whatever, I was looking into numbers for gun deaths, right? And they talk about how a high percentage of them or whatever are like how terrible the gun deaths are in the country. When you look into the number of gun deaths, though, like a significantly high portion of them are suicides. That's not mentioned. They're not separated out. They should be, in my opinion. There's a set of information to go into in that regard. That's what I'm getting at, as far as like just taking one statistic and not diving into it to try to figure out what it is. And what I'm getting that as far as the policy, if there's a racist policy, we absolutely need to change that, right? Sure. Not arguing that in the slightest. But what I'm saying is, you do have to show, like, it's racist, and I'm not getting to the point where you're like, okay, so if it is the case, if we do distill this down, and we find that there's a racist administrator calling cops on black kids, then of course you fire them. Like, that's why you handle that. But is it the actual policy that's racist in that regard? What part of the policy is targeting black people? That's what I'm getting at.
If I created a piece of gun control legislation, and in my gun control legislation, I made it that this is the law. I'm gonna lay out the policy. The law is handguns in my state are banned outright. We're doing this because the vast majority of deaths are coming from three groups: the Lollipop Gumdrop Brigade, the Black Nationals of Western Kentucky, and the Redneck Coalition. These are the three groups. I only do research on the Black Nationals of Kentucky. And when I justify this bill and the restrictions of this bill, my research is only within the Black Nationals of Kentucky. The Black Nationals of Kentucky are a majority Black organization. Is that a racist policy if I'm using the justification of that policy of those two other groups?
Is it a racist policy to ban handguns? Like,
is it a racist policy to ban handguns in this scenario? And I'm citing three groups. I only do research for one of those groups. That group is Black majority. I do zero research of the other two groups, but in my advocacy for the legislation, I cite all three groups together. Is that a racist policy?
well, if you haven't done the research, like, and you're saying you did, that's one, untruthful.
But is it racist?
Like, are they making the decision because they're Black?
It doesn't matter because they're Black. I'm saying that
it does.
the reason
That's
the
what
reason
makes
why
it a racist decision.
Ooh, we found it. So the reason why I'm banning this is because these three organizations are carrying handguns in my area, and they disproportionately are just having it in front of citizens. And I really just don't want that in my community. I'm only doing research on this Black Nationals group, though. But rhetorically, I'm using the other three for my pushing of the legislation, and it passes with that. Later, it's found out that I only did research of one of those groups, that group being majority Black. Is that a racist policy?
I guess you'd have to look into it. Like,
I laid out that we did. We noticed that the
you
research...
haven't actually looked at the other things. Like, okay, if your policy, if you're wanting to get rid of handguns because they're like open carry, is what it sounds like you're talking about. Like, if you're trying to ban handguns because
I'm talking about the Mulford Act specifically.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
Okay, the Mulford Act is a piece of gun legislation in California that restricted the use of public carry of handguns, and specifically shotguns and firearms. What they found in the research is that the Black Panther Party were openly carrying firearms, which was legal at the time in the United States and was legal in California specifically. When Don Mulford was creating his policy, he cited three groups: the Young Patriots, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Black Panther Party. Research showed that there was only one group that was openly brandishing firearms, which was the Black Panther Party.
Oh, okay. I get what you're saying now. I misunderstood what you were saying before.
Sure.
As far as like your research. Yeah, I mean, clearly at that point we're talking like races. If they're just removing guns from Black people. Like,
sure. So do you think that intent matters for racist policy? Do you need intent for a policy to be racist?
Not necessarily. Like, you could have all the best intentions in the world, but it could end up being racist if it only impacts one race.
Sure. So when I laid out earlier about that policy or that procedure, that procedural practice in Loudoun County, they found that Black students were getting police called on them disproportionately more than white students for the exact same offense. The offense particularly being that they call it simple assault, and another word, assault or simple battery that didn't result in bodily injury. So what that looks like is that if I were to push Prime and they find through the contuffle that he's not hurt, I'm not hurt. but the police are still called in that exchange. And disproportionately, it's happening to black students and students of color. Is that a racist policy?
Well, its implementation is racist.
There we go. Okay. So
Like,
we're on the,
you know, so
we're
the
on the
policy
same
itself
page.
is not.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No. I'm...
Oh wow.
So
that was really well done.
Crown me.
So, Manbeard, are you familiar? Just a question for you: are you familiar with the terms like de facto versus de jure or de jure, and as it's more commonly pronounced? So yeah, that de jure or de jure is literally Latin for like concerning law. It relates to it relates to how things are in terms of, you know, in terms of how they're written in the letter of the law. For example, de jure, the federal government of the United States has no official language. De facto means considering fact, which means which basically means even if it's not like legally official, this can still be something that's true. Like English is sort of the de facto language of the federal government of the United States, since that's and even all the states where English is not officially the official language, because you know that's just the language that we generally that business is generally conducted in with the government and whatnot. So for example, do you see how like a policy with like given all of the stuff that you and Joe just talked about, do you not see how a policy could be de facto racist without being de jure racist? For example, another YouTuber I watched did a great video about this where he talked about there was a club when he was a teenager in the area he lived in, and this club very specifically banned patrons from wearing Tommy Hilfiger clothing, as well as other fashion state trends at the time that were stereotypically associated with black people. You not see how that kind of stuff, even though it's not like outright saying like this policy targets black people like out, even if it doesn't say that outright, do you see how it could end up affecting them even if it doesn't say that outright?
Sure, I totally can understand that, and I can understand individuals making that type of rule or whatever. I want to keep it out of the public sphere. Like our government can't make those type of things.
Let's go to Shadow, who's been waiting very patiently. We're gonna let everyone else in too. Oh, sorry, not Shadow. It's gonna be Sinister.
What? Hey,
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Aggressive. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to bring up that kind of like broadens the conversation and hits on some points that we're talking about earlier, specifically. Sorry, Joe and Rage, what they were talking about, and then addressing sort of what Manbeater was saying about, you know, why we're focusing on certain racial issues, or why they're sort of why race has become, you know, more important in certain discussions. And he seemed to be suggesting that it was maybe because it's the left that are focusing on these things, or like critical race theory is stoking these certain, you know, racial resentments or sentiments. But I think what I wanted to address sort of was the difference in the sort of rhetorical and media sphere on the right and left. And I think Joe was sort of getting to this earlier as well. So why are we focusing on things like CRT? Why is there the sort of siding with the white person in the scenario in New Jersey? Why are we focusing specifically only on trans women in certain bills and not trans men at all? Well, I would argue it's because the right ecosystem is sort of univocal in their in how they push certain talking points that stokes these certain things in society that we don't see as much of on the left. And I would argue that that left media, maybe we should have the conversation around left media being more like right media and sort of pushing for the good in society, or pushing for more positive talking points to push against the right, for example, because the right is so effective in sort of stoking up, you know, racial animus, this anti-CRT stuff, whatever. But but the left isn't as effective. And I think that sort of gets to the point as well of how do we, change people's minds? There's a lot of focus on sort of the individual level, whether we should be shaming people or what have you. But I think part of the issue is the fact that the right stokes up all of this bullshit, and then there's not like a unified response from the left. And so it's so much easier for the right to infect society and to infect the discourse negatively, and it's not so easy for the left.
Okay, so first, the negatively is only because it's coming from your point of view. All of our newscasts currently are total shit. They stopped being like actual newscasters. If you want any proof as far as like how the left mobilized the news side, all you have to do is look at the election, specifically the Newsweek article talking about how behind the scenes they were pushing their particular stories to get Trump not elected. That was a concentrated effort on the left side to frame everything going up until to the election. That's admitted in print. So to say that they don't have the power, they're not doing things, is just untrue. We have a major real world consequence of it. But in general, news stopped being just going after the facts. They're now all slanting, and that's right or left for that matter. It's terrible. And unfortunately,
here's what
we
I'm
don't have any alternative. We can't just go somewhere to get our facts. Which is a detriment to all of American citizens because they don't have just a easy way of getting that information.
Well, I'm
Do you
talking
think
about like some
NPR is
specific
a-
issues in particular. So, like when I talked about CRT, for example, there is a pretty direct correlation that we can draw between Fox News mentioning CRT more in their broadcasts over the last couple months and the amount of people we see mobilized against it and the amount of legislation that we see that's anti-CRT coming up in different states. For example, like the Texas, I think it's the amendment that's going through the Texas Senate right now.
It passed.
It passed now? Yeah, that
Yes.
essentially erases, the teaching of MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech in, indigenous Native American history,
Does it actually
in
erase
feminist
that? Hold on,
movements,
hold on.
and in all these different
I want
anti-racist.
to make sure people understand. Does it actually erase that, or does it say that you can't
Yes.
be forced to teach it?
So what they said in the bill is that teachers are, to make it very clear, teachers should not teach the fall, and they listed
should not.
What they listed in the original wording of the bill was that a bunch of different things, including these individuals. Some of them were black, some of them were women, some of them were just broadly other things like the founding of the country. And then the second revision, when it entered the assembly again, it passed with the removal of black and female perspectives.
Okay, so should not be forced to do it, or should just
Yeah,
should
I'll,
not?
I'll put the bill in chat.
Okay,
Yeah,
I just want to be
do
clear.
you have a link for it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a whole fucking
It
drive.
So talking about this just last night, and it was like the bill does something like it basically gives instead of those people being like the teaching of those topics is encoded in statute. Instead, it leaves it up to the whatever the fuck the Texas state board that decides the shit that goes in their textbooks and whatnot.
The school board.
The same people who decided to change the wording of the textbooks to say the triangular transatlantic slave trade brought migrants from Africa to work here, instead of saying, those people were captives and they were enslaved and brought here to work against their will, which is why I actually took such issue with regardless of it might seem a little bit more innocuous if it's just the law just isn't forcing schools to teach this anymore. This is the reason why why teaching these subjects should be protected, at least in my point of view, is because that when you leave it up to these bodies like the Texas
Texas State School
whatever
Board.
the fuck they call the
Texas
curriculum
State-
board there,
Texas-
that's very easy.
Oh my God,
by the
Texas State
Republican
School
state
Board.
government.
Texas State School Board.
I can read it really quickly.
Yeah.
So, the bill as adopted said that the writings of, and let me make it from the top. It says, in adopting this essential knowledge and skills for the social studies curriculum, the State Board of Education shall adopt essential knowledge and skills that develop each student's civic knowledge, including the understandings of, particularly one of which is included, is the founding documents of the United States, including Declaration of Independence, Federalist Papers, Constitution, transcript of the Lincoln-Douglas debate, writings of George Washington, Una George, Jefferson, Hemmings. This is where black individuals were listed here, and they were taken out. Another revision came here, the writings of Frederick Douglass's newspaper in North Star, Book of Negroes, Fugitive Slave Act. So a lot of this was omitted. The one thing that got to the news cycle was there was a teaching requirement saying that I said it earlier, that white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan were morally wrong. And that was omitted from the new bill.
So it was omitted, not that it's saying that you can't talk about those things. I'm sorry, maybe I'm missing it. Maybe you're saying
No, but what it's saying
It's
is
what it
basically
says.
that it's no longer it's not required teaching. So those
That's
are
what-
things that
that's what I
Joe
said.
listed were things that
That's-
it required them to teach on the original bill as it was presented and as it passed the Texas House of Representatives.
That's what I
This is
said.
the reason why I.
Yeah, but hold on,
This was bipartisan, by the way.
But hold on,
Like,
but
this was
the-
bipartisan.
But I want to be
support.
very clear. It's what it's saying, right? Whether it, so what I said from the beginning is like whether they simply couldn't be regulated to teach about these things. It's not that they couldn't teach about these things, but simply that.
So
they're
here's
not-
here's the contention one, right? And this is like the one that buzzes. And I'm curious about Bearded's thoughts on this. So the things that they're not allowed, right? So the wording, which is identical, is that a teacher may not be compelled to discuss a particular current event or widely debated or currently controversial issue of public policy or social affairs. A teacher who chooses to discuss a topic described in the subdivision, which is all the stuff before about the Declaration of Independence, yada yada, shall do their best to their teaching ability to strive to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. And then particularly they restricted as follows. I'm going to read it verbatim because it's kind of on the nose. With respect to the relationship to American values, slavery and racism are anything other than a deviant from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, including liberty, equity, and require the understanding of the 1619 Project, a state agency, school district, or open enrollment charter, blah, 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 blah. Basically saying that you cannot if you're a part of those groups.
Wait, you cannot compel, right? Just clarifying.
You cannot
like
you cannot
this-
teach it outright. Like you cannot
Wait,
teach it, and that cannot be
I thought it was-
compelled
I
to.
thought you said compel.
Yeah, so the language was compelled, but that language basically means that you're not allowed to teach it. Probably that's the
No,
same
that
stuff that's
doesn't
used.
sound
like
like the same.
Probably?
That
Or,
doesn't
like,
sound.
You're
like
not
the
allowed.
same.
Period. You're not allowed. Period.
No,
like
no,
that's.
that doesn't sound.
That
like,
wasn't the way I was
Yeah.
reading about that at least.
I'm sorry.
but,
If you have some sort of some legalistic knowledge on this, then maybe I'm not understanding.
Yeah.
it.
So
But the word
when they say a
compel-
teacher may not be compelled, usually when it comes to the school board level, they consider the teaching of curriculum as compellment. It's a really weird legalese that they use.
Okay, all right. Then I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, fair
So,
enough.
so
I
if
wanted
the
to-
teacher were to do it on their own, what is like?
It'll be a violation of the bill, and they could be fined upwards. I think it's like $5,000, $2,500 to $5,000, something like that.
Dari, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just I was
I'm-
waiting for the
Dairy,
rounds to go around.
sorry.
Yeah, Dairy, whatever. Because the name of the I feel like I'll be going off track. Sorry, I held the hand up for after the current
Oh, okay.
topic.
Okay, if you want to wait, that's fine. Fine. Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to wait.
No,
yeah.
no problem. But okay, so I was just a little confused about that. But if you're saying it's compellment is something specifically.
Yeah,
for-
so like as an example, right? Like if the Kyle Rittenhouse situation happened and I wanted to teach a piece of curriculum, you may be rejected by the school board or your supervisor for that. Generally speaking, when you have regulation around things that you may not be compelled, they consider that based on like your own volition or the volition of the school board. Just to make that clear. When I say school board, I mean like all the way up from the superintendent down.
Thank you, Joey. I was misunderstanding all that legalese bullshit a little bit, and that's part of why I was bringing up the linguistics relating to all this shit earlier, is because, yeah, legalese is often, this kind of like legal writing is often written in a way that's just incredibly confusing for the layperson that's not frequently dealing with like legal cases. A sentence will have 50 fucking billion modifying clauses on it that can just make it easy to get a little bit lost. And yeah, I was opposed to this measure also. Just I was in the what the impression I was getting was that the bill, it like took away, it was made to look more innocuous by simply being like, oh, we're not totally banning this, we're just making it so that it's not completely required by law, and that it's left to, they start virtue signaling about parents and teachers and the administrators.
Yeah.
But
And to be,
yeah.
not to cut you off like real quick, there's two, I misrepresented something, I want to clear it up, so because I think I see the contention here. There's two parts of these bills usually. The first part is like the compelling, like not being compelled to. And then there is the may not. So the wording of that is, which is B number 4 of House Bill 3979, is that a teacher, administrator, or other employee of a state agency, school district, or open enrollment charter school may not, and then it says be required to engage in training, orientation, or therapy that presents any form of race or sex stereotyping or blame on the basis of race or sex. And then it goes on a bunch of things. The 1619 project statute is under may not. Another one is that the advent of slavery, and this is may not, the advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States of, with respect to their relationship to American values, slavery and racism, or anything other than a deviation from, etc.
Yeah, okay, so here's what I don't understand. That's actually, isn't that what you want it to be? They can't say that slavery is what the ideal foundations of our country should be?
The argument is had, like the argument within the 1619 project, and particularly with certain realms when we're talking about the analysis of race, is that the American experiment, and what we now know as America, was founded and created, like one of the pivot, like the forefronts of its creation was the protection and perpetuation of slavery. Whether that, and but what it looks like more broadly and more nuanced is that you had slaveholding interests and non-slaveholding interests. And just because something was non-slaveholding interests doesn't intrinsically mean that it was against slavery. Examples of that being like the Fugitive Slave Act in California, which was more strict than the one that was currently in the Constitution, stuff like that.
Sure, but what I'm saying is, the way I am reading this is that our actual founding principles are not necessarily what they were when the country was actually founded, but what we now understand them as they should be. And in that case, slavery is, against those founding principles.
Well, here's the issue: is this bill is essentially compelling teachers to teach a history from a particular perspective. You can't even question the fact that slavery is a deviation from like America's founding principles. You can't even propose an alternative narrative that says, no, actually, a lot of the founding fathers owned slaves, and the fact that slavery was, a huge part of, the ideology.
Say that it is a deviation. Like that is what this is actually saying.
Nothing but a deviation. So the problem is that, and this is the as you can kind of maybe hear, is that the issue is that, like, if I want to make the argument that, which again is generally speaking a true statement, is that you had slaveholding interests and non-slaveholding interests, and those two interests were in the forefront of not only the creation of things like the Declaration of Independence, but our Constitution, as well as the expansion into now what we know as the United States. That was always an argument, which even you could argue led to the
American values. That's the formation of our country. Yeah, but in particular, this Section 9, the respect to the relationship to American values, we're talking about what our American values are, like right now, like freedom.
Right,
Slavery
but
is a betrayal of that.
But historically, we did a very good job at being hypocritical about the very founding of those policies and principles. And then when we talk about deviation, we're talking about a practice in the United States that is that just eclipsed. Like the United States is younger than the upholding of slavery and what we now know as the United States. So how long is a deviation? Right? Like we're talking about a practice that was over 500 years, and then the United States is only just passing what 246 years this year. So like, how long is a deviation in the eyes of an individual? And that's like I think a decent question to try to answer.
What I'm getting at is, I think this is specifically this section 9 here is specifically just talking about in relation to American values. So anything that you were just discussing, I don't see how that would be banned by the statement.
How my argument here is that I don't believe that the upholding of slavery was a deviation in America.
No. So you think American values right now support slavery?
I'm not talking about right now. I'm talking
But that's what I'm saying. This is.
I could clarify some stuff.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say here is that from prehistory of the United States to now, we not only see the effects of slavery, but we also see the effects of not treating individuals in equal eyes and protections. And then we use different framings to justify and rationalize that practice. As example, if we're a country where all men and women are created equal, why is it that for hundreds of years that was literal, that all men are created equal? And then even then, it wasn't all men. It was particularly a particular class of men. And then it's like, if we want these values, and these are the values that we're upholding, why are we still fighting for trans rights in 2021? Why are we still fighting for just protections under the law? It's like, it seems like there's a hypocrisy that exists within even our foundation of the United States. Would you not agree with that?
Well, okay. I mean, yes, I agree with what you're saying as far as that goes. But what I'm saying is this document right here, that's like none of what you're talking about, I see as being banned by this piece of legislation.
It doesn't have to be banned. You can compel people to not do something by making something just ambiguous enough to not have supervisors, school boards, or even teachers approach the topic. As an example, we could have an incident of overt racism in the United States that say like somebody just an entire sea of indigenous folks in a school, and then like should a teacher talk about that in terms of their in for the day? Like, would we even like? That's the problem that the teachers are arguing that exists. Is that, for example, in terms of current events, some things are unavoidable. Like, how are you supposed to have a conversation and go through your everyday life when 9/11 is happening first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. in your elementary school or middle school? Like, you're going to have to talk about this. And the issue here and the problem is that these bills are worded in such a way where it's not explicitly clear what is permitted and what is not permitted.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty simple. I gotta go to Rage, Dan, and then G Master. G Gamer. I'll get your name. Anyways, so we'll bounce around, and then Dari, did you want to go after that? All right.
Yeah, I was still like waiting, like probably 25 minutes ago.
But I thought you said you wanted.
Well,
to
I didn't want to derail, but the topic keeps changing. So last I checked on the refresh, the title of the stream was Karen should we shame them. And I don't know if that's changed in the last like few minutes, but yeah, I'm still waiting for the round on that. I have like a thing to say. If I could say it, then probably leave because
just say it.
I like to talk about like the topic that I come on for. Yeah. So earlier we talked about Karen's being fluid. I haven't seen the attachment to minorities to Karen like that facet, except for like some circles on Twitter and some circles on Twitch. Usually, like where I'm from, it's just someone that likes to complain to the manager, probably an older lady. Trump complained about like some companies, like, oh, that's a Karen, that's the same thing. It's fluid. The problem is that the way it was defined here is that it also included those other attributes, and we were talking about convincing people whether or not they're that far extreme version of Karen, which is, the racist, etc., or the more quote unquote moderate one, the one that might complain to a manager, which could be anyone's mother, almost. And so we need to focus on that moderate group a bit more. And that last election was a big wake up call for how people come out and what they come out for. We just have to like face that fact. And so if we deem a group of people that we might either, in this specific instance, call a Karen, be like, oh, that's a Karen, you know, she's middle-aged, she's white, so she's probably also these other traits that I associate with this word, then you're putting yourself in an extreme instead of accurately identifying a real extreme that exists. And so you can kind of think of it as, I guess, deviations. We're using statistical terms, deviations from an empirical rule where someone might be too extreme to convince, but don't be on the other side where you're too extreme to be someone that wants to convince people. It seems to be an easy thing to trip up on. And that's kind of what I wanted to end on.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate
Take
it.
care.
Buddy.
Good night.
Have a good one. Thanks for coming by. Really appreciate it. All right, so let's go to Rage Dan, G Gamer.
If I was to steel man the bill or the interpretation that Manbeard is explaining, or it would be that slavery and the terrible stuff that our country has done as a deviation from the, like, when America, like the founding documents are like everybody is created equal. And it's like, obviously throughout history people have not been created equal, or they have not been treated equal. And a lot of people would argue that's a deviation from the core principles that our country was founded on. Whereas there are alternative views where some people just believe that America was actually, like, that's the lie. They say it was never founded on equality. America's just a racist country, and it always will be a racist country. And the bill is saying, no, you can't teach kids that perspective. There is value in teaching alternative perspectives, but just that bill doesn't want people to teach that one.
But wouldn't that go under the idea that you don't want to be impartial to any viewpoint? So wouldn't you want that argument for people to understand how it exists and how it manifests?
I mean, I think it's a valuable one. I don't know about necessarily teaching little
I don't know
kids.
if it needs to be
depends on
taught
what
in public
age.
schools. Yeah.
Well, no, I think in high school you can teach kids like how messed up the country is.
We do that already, yeah.
But like maybe not like little 6-year-olds, teaching them like, oh yeah, our country has just always been racist. Like maybe
Sure,
that's not the right way to approach
I
that.
think one of the issues is this bill seems to be picking a particular ideology and
It is.
privileging it over
It
others.
is.
And that's
Just
the problem that I
It's
have.
pro-American.
Well,
like you know how like
yeah,
governments want to create citizens that are pro their country, and that's what they're doing in that bill. Like Texas,
But if that whitewashes or misrepresents certain parts of history, that's also a problem.
problematic.
but
Yeah.
that's
Just
that's
for
what I'm
reference,
getting at.
okay? So like Florida, DeSantis, or the state legislature in Florida introduced a bill to make November 1st Survivors of Communism Day. It didn't make it far, but that's a thing that happened in this, this legislative
Florida,
cycle.
there's like a lot of people from Cuba, right? And so there's a lot of people who fled Cuba
Castro.
because Castro. So I think that's what that's.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to touch that.
What's
one.
sort of
I'm
ironic
just saying,
is like
there's only
the,
one type of Cuban that fled Castro, and they tend to be pro-capitalist, rich white folks. But you know.
mean, that's a big topic.
But
and
sure. But like,
it's a whole fucking can of worms we open up there.
Yeah, but like, I disagree. My big disagreement here with the Rage is that you can't teach, and I guess there's also a disagreement with Beard, our Beard friend, is that you can't teach kids at a young age like what was actually happening in the country. What we actually are taught oftentimes in history class is straight up fucking lies, right? Like, we don't get the full story, and then you have to spend time.
I'm not saying that you can't teach kids.
Let me finish my point. That you literally have to spend time deprogramming yourself, right? Like, so, like, and all the times you don't get this information anywhere in like education, right? Like in like a K through 12 education, and if you're not in college, or if you don't specifically look out for this material yourself, then you won't find it. You won't realize, oh, that's dumb. And then that has policy reflections. So because we don't actually teach like the true history is a tough term, but like a more complete history of the Americas that includes other peoples, includes the brutality that is American history, that's reflected on policy. So when a subject like CRT comes up, you can just simply say, well, no, that's not the history I know. You're trying to rewrite history to say that systemic racism is a thing. As far as I know, I was never taught that, so you must be lying.
Yeah, just like the narrative
Right,
that
I
the
don't
Civil War was
disagree
like all
with.
about states' rights or whatever. Like
We
these are
need
things
to.
that are like taught in textbooks. Like what was the famous one, the Louisiana one that starts its chapter about the Civil War, talking about how terrible it was that this particular family in the South was dispossessed of their slaves. And that's the first thing it talks about. Like these things are issues.
Or even in
education.
my former the school that I graduated from, my high school, didn't have the Dred Scott decision anywhere in the conversation about the Civil War. It wasn't even nothing, zero. And on top of that, also didn't include things like the Tulsa Race Massacre. It didn't include the Great Migration. It didn't include the Harlem Renaissance. It didn't include the Second Renaissance in the 70s. It was just a lot of omissions.
So go ahead, finish your point, Rage, and then I want to go to Dan and G Master.
I don't disagree with you that we should be teaching kids like what actually happened, like the truth. But there's always different ways that you can, like different perspectives that you can give the truth. And so, and I'm not necessarily of the same opinion as the people who wrote this bill. Like I'm not a Republican. But if I was to steel man their argument, they are saying they don't want the perspective to be like the I hate America perspective. It should be America did bad because we were wrong, but not America is bad and we've always been bad. Like that's the perspective they don't want.
The values that we hold right now are not negative, and we can see that we have become better because we have become more in line with what our values are.
Here's the thing about Joe. Here's where I agree with Joe, and that so the values previously, right? The values that created slavery weren't a deviance, right? That was the values that this country was founded over, was brutality, right, and racial supremacy. Like it's in the Constitution. We can pretend that it's not. It's there. We amended it out, more or less, right? So like that's the truth. And then to say, so we can teach that, right? But then I hear you saying, well, that the country is still bad, that it's always been bad. Well, first of all, I mean, like our history of like racial supremacy and brutality has never ended, right? There's never been an endpoint to that. Oftentimes we export that in our foreign policy, right? So like, one, are we good? Are we the good guys at this point yet? I would actually disagree that we were, but still, let's say you didn't want to go that far. Fine, right? You're not a lefty like me. Great. But even then, right? Even if you're whitewashing the current place and time, to say that, well, because we taught about like these things that happened in the past necessarily reflect on me, right? This is literally what we were talking about in the previous panel, right? You're saying that there are terrible things happen in the past, and then somehow by magic that makes me a racist.
Not by magic.
How? Like, go ahead.
Sorry, can you let him finish real quick? Like, sorry, makes you what?
Makes you makes you racist. Makes you racist. That's what I'm saying.
The things in the past.
The things in the past
make you racist.
Yeah, magically make me in the present a racist. Like you're calling my history racist, right? And because I have some sort of connection to that history, because I appreciate that history, because that history means so much to me, right? Well, then I must be racist too. And this is what seems to be happening. At least with my interpretation of what's happening with a lot of people, right? Even if you're not calling them racist, right? But they interpret it as like, or like, especially if they have like a connection, like a grandfather, right, who fought in the Civil War, right? Well, your like on the Confederate side, your grandfather, yeah, it might have been a fucking racist. I don't know what to tell you, buddy. It doesn't say anything about you, but people take that immediately to be an attack on themselves without not just acknowledging, yeah, your father ended up fighting for the side that was for slaveholders. You know, it is what it is. But we can just accept that fact and move on, right?
Right.
I think it's a
That
bit
in
of
particular is.
I think it's a bit of a self-report if you think anti-racism is somehow an attack on you or like you personally or
That
your
statement.
family
No,
history or whatever.
it's the associated white guilt that is like propagated currently.
It's just righties trying to misrepresent what Robin DiAngelo writes about. They've made her and Ibram X. Kendi a deliberate target to their works and writings rhetorically, despite the fact that their works are not used in school curriculums.
So
reason why
I just want
go ahead, Prime.
I just want to get to Dan's been waiting so patiently. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah.
I am. Yeah. Mr. Beard, do you think? What do you think? Do you think like something like the 1776 project is like a better way to teach kids, or you have to take all these different projects out entirely? In your opinion,
I've heard it mentioned, but off the top of my head, I'm not familiar, like with the project you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was.
I mean, I'll just explain my own opinion. Like my opinion on the 1619 project is that I don't exactly agree with the entire original premise on the whole thing, but I do think that it was admirable to try to look into a perspective that isn't very much taught in U.S. schools, which for sure is definitely African slavery before United States and all that. However, there has been some little inconsistencies about the 1619 specifically being the day that African slaves showed up to the mainland. I've literally read stuff that's like earlier than that from the Spanish of African slaves around the 1580s, and there's in much of the whole entire thing in general, as it originally was like assumed to be just the entire reason of the Revolutionary War is done by just because of slavery. I I don't. That isn't the entire point. I would say that Deleuze pointed the best out is that there's many different interests of that. Slavery is definitely one of them, and actually was there was not even supposed to be much of like a 3 out of 5 compromise for slavery until the South, like I believe South Carolina delegates were like adamant, like it has to be there or we'll be unrepresented. It's a lot of that has to be done to point out, but it's entirely to my disagreement that it's the whole reason though. That's my turn.
Let's go to G Gamer. I was calling you G Master. Why was
Yeah, my username on Discord is Gmaster, but I changed it to G Gamer the first time you said that. So yeah, sorry if that was confusing.
Okay.
But I think the point that I wanted to bring up has kind of passed, and other people have already said it. Just that like this bill we were talking about earlier. If I was a teacher, I wouldn't be allowed to say like our forefathers' values are what caused slavery to be able to exist in our country. I was
disagree
curious.
with that. You
I
would
was
be able to say that.
curious. Okay, I was curious if the bill was like K through 12 or if this is just elementary school students, because we were focusing a lot on like we shouldn't teach kindergarteners this. But I also don't think we need to be teaching kindergarteners that like Columbus discovered America and came over and everyone had a big happy feast. Like there is digestible ways that we can teach children about systemic racism in the origins of our country without like being graphic and violent. I also wanted to talk about how like I think it was clarified the definition of compel would mean that like they're not allowed to, but like even the most well-meaning teacher doesn't have time to teach non-required curriculum. And if something's not required, it's very, very likely to be passed up on. And I guess we were kind of getting into this, but back to Manbeard's point that like CRT groups students together and therefore it's racist. I'm not convinced, and I'm curious why you think, like, first of all, it's grouping students, and second of all, why you think that teaching that like white people did racism makes racism continue against white people. I was curious why you were convinced of that.
No, there were okay. So first off, if sorry, I got to get name up. If Joe was corrected, that was 3 instances, all like not actually in the classroom or compelled teaching, then I'm misunderstood what that was. If there is such a thing as forcing them to split along segregation, teaching them separately, or sorry, splitting them amongst racial lines and teaching them things differently based off that, yes, 100% I'm against that. Saying that we were racist as a country in the past is just fact. Like, I'm not, trying to say that didn't happen. There are talks, and I'm not saying it happened in this Discord at all, but there are talks of versions of uh, reparations for things that happened back then that are things that didn't happen in anyone's like current lifetime, and like that is just propagating like further racism because you're doing things based off racism that doesn't have anything to do with anyone here currently.
Why do you feel like people are asking you to take accountability for your ancestors' actions? Like, no one's asking you to do that. So why do you feel that way?
When you're told that you don't get to say anything because you're white.
Who's ever said that to you?
Where?
That happens on the internet. Like, so.
Okay. So yeah, social justice warriors are on Twitter. But was anywhere outside of the internet?
But that's a very vocal thing.
They don't.
Yeah,
They don't control
work.
legislation, so you should probably ignore them and focus on the arguments within your local communities.
Twitter LARPers are Twitter LARPers. That's really the sum total of that.
Being told that you can't talk in a group because you're white at your place of employment, like, happens today.
Can you quantify that claim?
Like, it happened to me at my job.
Okay. Do you have any other example outside of your personal?
I mean, you can look at.
There are other places mentioned it online.
I can give you. So I don't know why you guys are minimizing this as if this isn't like fucking everywhere. During like after the 2016 campaign, this is like the most stark example of this happening to me, right? Not to me personally, but me seeing this for myself. I think it was Simone Sanders, who was Bernie Sanders' like PR director or some shit during his campaign, was on CNN talking to I forget his name. The guy that said that the plane went into the black hole, I forget his name. And she said something like, and it was him and a couple other guests on this panel, whatever, right, on CNN. And she said something like, we don't need white old men running the Democratic Party right now, right? And just throwing in the white thing like out of nowhere, and got zero pushback on that. Now, to me, that's pretty like obviously a racist thing to say. You would dismiss somebody from a leadership position because they're white. Right?
But you can also
it got zero pushback. This was in the mainstream media, on a TV channel that millions of people watch. Zero pushback. So to say that it's only happening online and that people aren't seeing it in their day-to-day lives and it's not being normalized is kind of silly.
Do you believe that Black Americans have substantive representation in Congress right now?
I don't know what the fuck that means. People vote if they choose to vote for a black person or a white person or whatever. It's not really.
Do you think that Black people have substantive representation to approach the issues like institutional racism, structural racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion?
What do you mean by representation? Do you mean like Black people in these spaces? As if
no, I'm talking about
represent Black people.
I'm talking
what
about
do you mean by that?
I'm talking about this. So substantive representation. I'm sure you're aware of this, Doobie. I don't know why you're doing this. Like So
just tell me what you mean by
representation means
representation.
that there's policy that leads to the actual change that we desire. This is something that Prime and I had a back and forth about a couple maybe a year ago at this point, about the Biden's cabinet, where one of the problems with the Joe Biden administration is that sure, it's totally fine to have symbolic representation, and some people really appreciate that. We can look at Andrew Yang as an example in New York City. However, there's also the acknowledgement that just because you have a black face in a position of power doesn't mean they have the interest to push things to a way that actually shows change, whether it be for police reform, equity, inclusion, and diversity in school levels, at the school board level, police accountability, whether that be accountability for something as simple as like open transparency of reporting information for law enforcement officers. Like those are substantive policy like demands of a lot of people on the left about like, these individuals, although sure they may look like us, but they don't necessarily have the, maybe whether it be the will or what have you, to push towards a change that isn't just the status quo of somebody else from before. Like this is the same reason why.
So all you're saying is you've discovered that black people, like other races, aren't a hive mind, and they might have different ideas as to how to go about these things and how to improve society. So yeah, they have representation in these spaces. Maybe that representation isn't pushing policy that you think is effective, but they're pushing policy that they think is effective because yeah, they might have different ideas. That doesn't mean that they're not representing black people, because I'm sure these black
it
people
doesn't have nothing.
and white
It has
people
nothing to do.
vote them
I
into
don't want
these
you to
positions of
strawman me here,
power. I'm
Doobie.
not strawmanning you.
I'm not talking about the modern discourse of identity politics here, of just basing it on skin tone. I'm talking about substantive representation. You can make the argument that we can critique. I'm not going to gish gallop. I'm not fucking Rob Nord, dude. I'm going to answer what you're going to say.
Don't one at a time.
Like, come on, man.
And also, McSpeen Wolf, please take over from me. I gotta step away for a second. But go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, to be clear, we can recognize that Simone Sanders, on its face, could be questionable about her potential advocacy towards white people. That's a claim that you can have. But something that's a little bit deeper here is a recognition that for the longest time, and this is where the problem is that for Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, and people of color, they haven't had the type of substantive representation to lead to actual policy change. What ends up happening is that you have individuals who are openly willing to cater to these blocks of the electorate and say like, hey, we care about civil rights. Like we're looking to push this policy and that policy, but then when the rubber actually hits the road, nothing happens to that. And this is a problem that the Democratic Party has, and this is even a problem that Republicans are sort of slowly trying to acknowledge. And then like if you think I'm trying to gish gallop here, then feel free to call me out on that. But I don't know if I'm not too sure what your contention is. Here's what I'm saying.
Okay, well let me explain. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me explain. So what I'm a little confused about, Mr. Joe, is that you brought up skin tone when you mentioned these people, right? I said, oh, just because they have the same skin tone as me, they're not pushing for these substantive changes or whatever, right? So it seems to me like you are talking about people that have the same skin tone as black people and their representation within these positions of power. Now, if you're not talking about that, that's okay, right? If you're saying that they're electing representatives that are getting into these positions of power, and these representatives, once they're there, are not pushing for this change that they promise to push for. That is a problem that exists across the electorate all over the fucking country, whether you're white, black, Asian, whatever, right? Yes. But it's also the case that sometimes people do get the political willpower together to push policy through. A lot of policies have been passed over the last 20, 30 years have been directly aimed at making the lives of black people better. Right? So it's not like it's not as if nothing is getting done. So if all you're saying is, wait really quickly, but I don't see how any of that relates to the fact that Simone Sanders was on TV and was able to be casually racist toward white people on a mainstream news outlet and got zero pushback.
Well, I mean, let's talk about the pushback then. Is she in any type of position currently in the... Well, actually, that's not true. Simone Sanders, I think, is the... She has some position in the Biden administration, albeit like a small role. And it might even be for Kamala here. I don't remember where she's at right now. But I would say that, yeah, like Simone Sanders' rhetoric is problematic. Is she... And I guess, do you think that she's going to end up in a position of power as a black woman? Or not, let me deracialize it, right? Do you think that she would have any political power currently in the Democratic Party with her current rhetoric around white people?
I mean, she's still a Democratic strategist, still pulled on my campaigns to help them out. So it's not as if she's not it's still involved in this, despite her overtly racist comments about white people, right? So it's not as if she's just been like exiled, right? But the only reason I brought this up, kind of getting back to the original contention here, was that I think you're minimizing the reality that casual racism directed at white people is normalized in a lot of these spaces, not just online spaces, but in the media, right? And I think that's a problem. I think it's something we need to be honest about.
Sure, but when black people talk about what they mean about these things, it seems it seems weird how like when we want to racially identify white people as a potential stopgap to a problem, then it seems like, oh, we shouldn't be racially categorizing or racially identifying them, despite the fact that Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, and other persons of color are quick to be racially identified in the political. But for white people specifically, there's a contention. But I'm assuming if you're consistent here, you'd have a problem with all of it.
Yeah, I don't like the identity politics thing.
But
I think that one of the consequences of that is that white people are going to become more racialized, more racially aware, and then you'll end up like we had earlier this all white everything panel. You're going to end up with white people pushing for spaces like that, pushing for the interests of their white group, and I think that's a massive problem that I don't think we should be going into. Right? I'd like to de-racialize people if possible. Right? I'd like the race to impact them as little as possible.
How do we de-racialize people when we still currently have legislation that creates protections and we have protected classes in the United States?
I think eventually those protections need to go away.
How long do you think that a process like that could happen?
A very long time. I don't think we're anywhere near first dealing with the consequences of slavery, of Jim Crow, redlining, all these fucking terrible things that have happened. The reservations that are still around that are fucking awful. There are all these terrible things that happened in the past that are still impacting people today that we need to deal with before we can even talk about that. Right? That's like 200 years down the road or some shit.
Like
I'm you two have been going back and forth for a little while now. I think there's some other people waiting to get in. I think it sounds like Manbeard's trying to say something. If there's anybody else who's waiting to say something, put your hand up. Manbeard?
So I think a big part of it comes down to like the equality versus equity like argument that's kind of made often. Like it's like I think Doobie stated, like just the fact that it's okay to be racist towards white people is just accepted. Like, and not like that's something that we need to like just get away from completely. Like,
Is it? Simone had quite a lot of pushback in the press, like honestly, even from like pretty liberal papers. Like, yeah.
Not
And
on
what
that
she
panel
said
in
wasn't
front of a
even-
national audience, in front of this journalist, this highly esteemed journalist, and all of his guests. She said this pretty overtly racist thing. Got zero pushback from any of them.
I mean,
if
said
she'd
hold
been,
on,
if there had been a white person directing that toward black people, saying we don't need a black leader in the Democratic Party, they would have, of course, gotten pushback immediately.
I mean,
Hold on. What contributes
isn't
more?
it a reasonable point if the leadership of the Democratic Party is like all white to say I don't think we need another white leader in the Democratic Party. We need some
No.
representation.
No,
So-
I don't think the
No?
race should be a factor at all.
Okay, well, I mean,
also-
I don't know if the vast majority of Americans would agree with you there. I don't think it's overtly racist either. I think it's kind of like debatably racist.
Yeah, Beer, do you think that race should not determine one's social economic outcome?
like from the perspective of the government, like absolutely,
All of it.
Like it shouldn't.
Yeah, so that's racial equity. So I'm wondering, like, what's your issue with that?
No, so okay,
And that's
yeah,
the first half of racial equity, mind you.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're coming from for that. So the difference is like coming from the libertarian side of things, it's all about your individual freedoms. So the moment that you go and attempt to take something from someone else, that's where you have the problem. So from our perspective, you want to pass policies that ban racial decisions. Period.
Wouldn't
because we
you-
think that race itself has no value.
If we understand, and Doobie would agree here, that we're not there yet, what is something that you think that we should do within the next 10 years to go towards something like that?
So, like, we're going to get there if we get our policies to not be racist.
Sure, but I'm asking you, like, where's the starting point? Like, we can
been like the whole time we've been marching towards that thing. Like, as far as, I don't see a method of doing so that doesn't have a backlash that furthers the racial problem.
Sure.
That's the problem that we're having right now.
Right, but like there's an acknowledgement within equity that we want to make sure that there aren't any sort of societal prioritizations towards people of certain skin colors. And with the understanding that we have to currently racially identify, I would say a vast majority of the procedures, policies, and practices benefit white people. And again, prioritization doesn't mean that it's a prioritization does not mean a guarantee, right? There's going to be individuals who racially identify as white who don't get prioritized and end up in poor socioeconomic statuses, poor political statuses, and what have you. But
the point is that if you're not taking race into consideration for any of those decisions, then that's not, being furthered.
Sure, but we've had examples of race neutral policies that led to poor outcomes that disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, and persons of color.
Rage comment? Awesome.
I would say just some examples of policies that would be quote unquote race neutral that would lead to better outcomes is like if you wanted to address like healthcare where there is disproportionate like bad outcomes for people of color. If you fix healthcare, especially for the poorest among us, that will shrink the gap between the outcomes. If you do like you make college more affordable, a lot of college debt is with poor people, like disproportionately. Even though there is a ton with people who are not of color, but shrinking those sort of things. You can do race neutral policies that still shrink the gap between the different ethnicities and races in our country. And I think those are sort of the policies that somebody like Manbeard and would think are
100%.
good.
Yep,
Yeah.
100%.
If we do completely race neutral policies, are we not looking at an extremely long stretch of time before there is any kind of equity? Because I mean, the concept of like sticky at the ends, right? Like the idea, yeah. So so if really simply, if you say that like, oh well, the problem is education, right? The problem is education because people need a good education to get a good job. Well, then you point out that like good education is not available to people who are poorer, right? Black people tend to be poorer, blah blah blah, right? You're not going to get a good job. And it goes back to the beginning. It's just fucking circular. So like the ability of people to move between these social groups is like a lot
Right.
harder. Yeah.
But you just brought up the answer to that. That's to attack the economic level of that. If
Yeah, exactly. But how? Sorry, go ahead. Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, how do you attack that in a completely non-racialized way? I
by
suppose
not
you.
allowing race to be a factor in it at all.
So I suppose
if
what you
forms that are
could-
filled out are not, you don't take their race. It doesn't matter. Like, we don't care
I
about
think
that
we still need ways to track discrimination. And I think people being able to racially
100%.
identify themselves is important. I think something that you might be in agreement here is that we don't really have conversations about the individual level of this example, right? I racially identify as Black. Then I think another question should be had of have you experienced or have I experienced just unequal policies or unequal practices based on the fact that I am Black, and then asking that question like, okay, well, where do you think this happens? I think something that gets lost in the conversation is the individual level of these interactions, these exchanges, and how these individuals interact with these systems. It's no different than how Democrats just ignored rural states, where there were issues in rural states, and those individuals in those areas felt like, for example, like West Virginia, just felt like they were being ignored by Democrats. And then when Republicans said like, hey, we hear your qualms and frustrations, and here's our policy prescriptions to solve these problems, sure that voter base voted for them, but then their conditions are still exactly the same, and then it's the same sort of circle back to the same problem. That's why I think substantive representation is incredibly important.
Maybe you'll know better than me, Joe, but like it, and I'm sorry, Manbeard, I'll let you go straight after. Oh, Prime's back, so he can. But yeah, so oh shit. Yeah, you might know this better than me, Joe, but like it was my impression that things like racial quotas for employment rate under affirmative action, these things were found to be unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. Am I right? And
yeah.
So, I mean, is your concern, Manbeard, around the actual like legislation? Because it would be my understanding that, like, broadly, the legislation would not be able to say, "Hey, we want to give, like, we want to give certain things to black people," right? Or is your problem around the rhetoric around it? Because my suggestion to fix this kind of thing wouldn't necessarily be legislation that has race in it, because there's some poor white folks who definitely need help as well economically, right? I would say that we would target those that are economically disadvantaged, and by doing that, we would be targeting more black folks than white folks, right? Just in the same way as legislation previously that has been that hasn't been worded racially but has been used deliberately to target black folks, right? We just do the fucking opposite, basically, right? And that will help some poor white folks along the way. Like, would you be against that kind of legislation, or is it like, yeah?
Well, in the example that you're providing, you're talking about addressing concerns for like an economic class, like just raising the poor, basically. And if that happens to impact more black people than white people, then like who cares? Like,
So I mean, that's what I'm saying is pretty much done now, right? Because it wouldn't be constitutional to specifically target like specifically and explicitly target a racial demographic in legislation outside of like discrimination law or whatever. But even that, right? They target classes rather than.
Well,
So is your problem the rhetoric around these things? People saying, "Oh well, we need to help black folks, so let's instate some kind of aid for the lowest economic class."
my problem comes with any kind of like racial thing into the public sphere. So, and by public I mean government. So the schools, the anything government. Like it's not because we have freedom of speech. There is no thing that the government's going to do to stop like racism as far as like talking or business choices that you make. They have the equal act of opportunity. That doesn't make discrimination illegal. It just means that you don't get government contracts to do that. There's nothing stopping you from like opening a black restaurant, not serving or sorry not hiring anyone but black people. Like you just.
I mean, there is. Wait, no. I mean, there is.
No, you can't. You
right?
can't deny service. But
No, you wait. Hold on, that's not true. There are laws against discrimination in hiring, like racial discrimination in hiring. So if you make it clear that you're not hiring this person because they're black or white or whatever, you will get sued.
Yeah, it's like almost impossible to
say that,
fucking
though.
prove
Most
unless
people
they
don't-
say it. But
Yes, but that's what
I
my
mean.
prerogative
It would be illegal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, but that's what I mean. Like,
If you don't want race anywhere in education, should we be teaching that instead of teaching that white people enslaved black people on the inception of the United States of America, should we just teach that some people enslaved some people?
No,
that's
Not-
totally
not that
taking
much.
out
That's
what
too
I'm
much.
saying.
Okay, so
Can I
there
ask,
is a balance there.
Black
No,
people
no,
had.
I
I
said
think that
specifically
And we can't
government
have color
decisions.
blindness in our education.
Black people had a slumber party over their white friends.
Yeah.
That's
no.
not even funny because I remember my like 8th grade state history. Like my teacher literally had to say that the slaves had barbecues on Sunday because it was in the fucking textbook. Like it's fucking terrible.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
So Joe, the thing you posted in VC chat, is that is that like a pro 1619 project bill or an anti 1619?
That would be categorically an anti 1619 project. It addresses it outright.
Well, yeah, so I've read through it a few times before I came on here, and I was reading through it earlier, and I just don't see the problem with any of this. They're not saying you can't teach race or racism or the history of slavery. So, like, I don't.
Sure. The problem, the thing is, that's not the target, right? So, the concern that I have with the entire conversation around this, we talked about this a little bit earlier, so I'll catch you up, is that they're using critical race theory as a shield, or really as a cudgel that we described earlier, to limit or restrict other types of practices, but it's going to create this sort of chilling effect that teachers argue. So what happens is that teachers will feel more apprehensive to look at certain things, like talking about current events in schools. Like sometimes like a current event in the outside world is unignorable in the inside. And sometimes teachers have to have those conversations. And legislation like this can make it difficult for teachers to even feel like they ought to do that. And that's something that like is very sort of restrictive of speech, where a teacher shouldn't feel that yes, there are restrictions in curriculums, and what you can and cannot do as a teacher, but to feel like you have to sort of think twice to talk about a current event that might even affect your own students. Like as an example, in my township, when the individual shot up all those nail salons, a vast majority of my students I teach in the marching band had friends and family who weren't in nail salons and worked in nail salons. And then the conversations about that were like they didn't feel safe in their own communities because and that's something that like you can't just like sort of, oh, we're just not gonna do this. Like people are effective and we have to have conversations about that. And bills like this make it a little bit restrictive, whether it be from the historical side or from history teachers or just broadly. But that's just one part of the many problems these bills can introduce.
So when the CRT thing started happening, it reminded me really very much of not only the United States when they said you can't teach communism, right? Which basically meant that people just avoided the topic of communism or socialism entirely, but also like Section 28 here in the United Kingdom, which forbade the teaching of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship and barred local authorities from promoting homosexuality, right? And so the so what you could do under that law, in theory, right, is say, well, homosexual people exist, right? You could say that. You could teach children that homosexual people exist, right? But nobody would. And nobody would, because the obvious intent of the law is to chill these discussions about homosexuality, basically, right? Section 28 was a fucking horrible dark time in British history. I grew up under it. Fucking sucks. So what I thought about CRT as soon as it came in, right? Like the amount of people who can't even fucking define it properly, right? The people who admit, like on school boards and school meetings, and the kinds of things that they put out, right? Like there was one school board that like openly admitted we don't really know what CRT is, but we're voting to ban it anyway, right? So people just are scared to talk about race in general in the classroom, and it has that broad chilling effect.
This is like when they protected us from Sharia law, though, right? You know, the encroaching Sharia law, was it in Kentucky?
True. No, well, I mean, Kentucky isn't being ruled by Sharia law right now, so like
mission
clearly
accomplished. Doobie.
Yeah.
Does like Christian
Yeah,
Sharia
so
law
what-
exist?
Wait, what?
What?
Does like Christian? I don't know. Never mind.
That's fine.
No, sure.
Go ahead.
And something rhetorically, which is a concern, like I just finished reading Kenny Zhu's book, The Inconvenient Minority, and something in that book that he argues a lot, that Asian Americans are the stepping point for America to enter into a colorblind society that prioritizes meritocracy. And something that he argues in that book is that Asian Americans have essentially a culture that can perpetuate and protect these things like meritocracy, hard work, two-parent households, that he goes in a lot about that, and that like the core of the argument is that Asian Americans, because Asian Americans succeed at such a high rate. Another thing he cites is that Asian Americans apparently on average study twice as much as any racialized group. And he's using these arguments as a way to justify that things like critical race theory are just a myth and a falsehood, and that they shouldn't be taught altogether and outright. And even when you look at deeper in the statistics, it's kind of strange when we understand like just one very basic thing is that we understand that yes, Asian Americans, when it comes to wealth, are generally speaking, their median income is higher until you make it to the bottom 10%, where they're just back into the same line as how the racial class system kind of works, where it's just white, Asian, Hispanic, black. And then something that CRT would propose is like, okay, why is it that Asian Americans are outperforming in the 90th percentile, the median percentile, but not the 10th percentile? And Kenny isn't making the claim that like Asian Americans systemic racism, Asian Americans haven't experienced inequality, but he's saying that like because of these cultural things and these essentialist ideas, which I don't think Doobie would support here, that we ought to use Asian Americans to lead toward a colorblind meritocracy.
Yeah, so can I say really quickly, I don't understand what you're getting at about the chilling effect, because all this bill says is that a teacher can't be compelled to discuss these things, but then it gives further guidance so that if they choose to discuss the current events, I think you brought up the example of like, what if there's a shooting at some indigenous school or at a nail salon or something. So if they choose to discuss these things, it lays out guidelines for how they should do that, and all it says is that they shall, to the best of their ability, strive to explore the topic from a diverse and contending perspectives without giving preference to any one of the perspectives. So I don't see how this is like a chilling effect. This is all this seems to me, I've read over this a few times now, this is that they can't be compelled by the school to talk about a current event.
Okay, so if I'm a teacher and I want to talk about a school shooting that happened nearby, and I choose to talk about it, then I have to talk about from a diverse perspective. So then, am I required to talk about it from the shooter's perspective?
What the
Like,
fuck?
what are
Wait,
what
do you
are
really
these
think
diverse
that's-
perspectives? And so,
Do you really
and
think
if
that's
I
what this
don't,
means?
excuse me,
That's the problem.
if I don't do that, if I don't follow these guidelines that are very vague, then I can be fined like a couple $1,000s. So the chilling effect is I'm less likely to speak about it because I'm worried I might not meet all of
Yeah,
these guidelines.
that seems really silly.
It is
It
silly.
seems more likely. What this means is that if let's say UBI is in the news and it's a big topic, or student loan forgiveness and it's a big topic, not part of the curriculum.
We're talking about current
and
events.
Well,
We're
yeah,
talking about news.
yeah,
like,
student loan
locally
forgiveness and the
that affects
push for that
students.
policy.
You wouldn't be able to
push for that
teach that
policy.
under the statute though, Doobie, because
hold
it
on.
clarifies about certain advocacy earlier in that bill. So that what you're
Wait,
describing,
that's
you
not
wouldn't be able-
true. But I know
Yeah.
it clarifies that you can't give extra credit. I think it says you can't give extra credit or awards for or grading awards for in the course for exploring current events. But it doesn't say that you can't talk about them, right? All this is that if you're going to talk about these current events, right, whether it's student loan forgiveness or BLM or whatever, right, that you should do it from a diverse perspective and provide contending perspectives, right? So I don't think they would extend it to say, oh God, if you don't present the mass shooter's perspective, we're going to fire you. That's kind of a ridiculous.
But it could
thing
be
to say.
interpreted that way.
But the
No, it
argument
can't,
here that teachers are having is that you can't just create a bill and just say like diverse perspectives. You should be clearly, and again, you can hear this in board meetings across the United States when this sort of thing comes up, is that the issue isn't about not being able to teach. Like the issue generally, so I'm trying to make this so it's really clear so you understand here, is that teachers need more guidance than just saying diverse perspectives. What does that mean in a practical situation?
How else would you say that?
They would have to clarify that.
Well, I mean, you give you're an intelligent person. So if they want teachers to present both sides of the student loan forgiveness argument, how would they say it without using in another way than like diverse and contending perspectives?
They basically can't label one side as like the
But that's not the point. You would have like it doesn't matter what my point, like this part of it is that it's up to the school boards and the state legislatures to make clear understanding of like what do you mean by diverse perspectives?
It
What is
seems very
considered
clear.
a diverse perspective?
Okay, so what about for slavery? What's the diverse perspectives on slavery?
Well, that's not what they're talking. Well, hold on, really.
Just use that example. Just use
Let
an
me,
example.
yeah, let me talk to Prime really quickly. So, Prime, this isn't talking about slavery, right? It's talking about current events. Right? It's just that teachers can't be compelled to talk about current events, but if they do, if they choose to, wait, hold on. If they choose to, they're encouraged to do it from to the best of their ability by presenting diverse and contending perspectives without giving a preferential treatment to either side. However, if you look further up in the bill, it actually lays out the exact course material that they're going to be going over to discuss slavery, to discuss slavery, Chicano movements. It tells you which books, which movements they're going to study. Like it lays it out pretty clearly, right? It's not saying that you need to cover those topics from the perspective of the slavers, right? And in fact, further down, it specifically says that you can't present the idea that one race is superior, or that someone is less than someone else because of their race, or is they're racist because of their race, or whatever the fuck, right? So it's in the bill. It's saying that you cannot teach racism to children. You can't teach the slavery inferior to the white slave owner. So I really don't understand what the issue is with this.
Your question was about the chilling effect, right? That was your original question. Like,
yeah. Well,
like,
I
where
don't
does the
think
chilling effect
any.
come from?
Well, I
The
don't think
chilling
it exists.
effect comes from the stipulations that are put on. I have to meet these guidelines of perspectives in order to talk about a current event with my classroom. And if I don't do that, I'm subject to fines. Yes, I should do that. But when I'm subject to fines, if I don't present the perspective of a school shooter and not give preferential treatment to either one, then I'm less likely to talk about it. And that's
Okay,
the
so
chilling
what's
effect
more
is.
likely to
It's
happen?
not an absolute. It's like a small effect that it's going to impact what I teach.
Mind you,
no
and
matter
the
what.
reason why teachers are concerned is that they already run into this problem with curriculum already, of superintendents and supervisors not giving clear guidance on what books to use, what educational materials to use, and what have you. And this is why, as another like effect, we see teachers going into weird sort of racial curriculum or race curriculum around slavery that is culturally insensitive and also sometimes age inappropriate. And then when you look at, okay, like what are the guidelines around like this type of education? And a lot of it is very vague and nebulous. So teachers take risks to do that. And when I say do that, do whatever the education prompt that they want to do, when in reality, there needs to be stricter guidance about like, here's the things that you can teach that are age appropriate. Here are the materials that you could use. Here are the sample materials. But even then, when that is brought up and not implemented, but introduced in policy, we still have predominantly the right arguing like, well, this is just another way to indoctrinate children. This is another way to influence like leftism and stuff.
To be fair,
okay, hold on, no,
this
wait, one
podcast,
sec,
you
please,
literally said
please.
that.
No, please, 1 second. I feel like you're like you ignored the entire first section of this because they lay out specifically which books, which authors, which writings they're going to be referencing.
If I want to teach anything outside of that list,
please, to talk about all these things, right? In fact, it goes into, there actually mentions that they're going to talk about the history of white supremacy, including but not limited to the institution of slavery, eugenics, KKK, and the ways in which it was morally wrong. Right, so
no, that was removed. Nope, Juby, that was removed.
No, it wasn't.
That was.
No, I'm looking at the enrolled version. No, wait, stop. I'm looking at the enrolled version of the bill. This is the final version of the bill. It is in there.
Are you looking at the chaptered version? There's a different version of that bill that exists. The morally wrong portion was omitted, was taken out. That was a big problem with this bill.
So, Han, could you put your link?
Let's compare.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Wait 1 second. So, Joe, that is in your link. It is page 3, right at the top of the page.
Hold on. Let's
Right,
make
so
sure
I
we're on the
don't-
same thing.
And to be clear, I looked to see if what you posted was the introduced version of or the enrolled version. It is a correct version. It's the enrolled version, the final version of the bill, and that is in there.
Okay.
The introduced version was 4 pages. This is 8.
Okay.
It's
in BC chat. Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. So it seems to me that it says, morally wrong, top of page 3. And again, here they're laying out exactly which writings they're going to go over, which authors are going to reference. In fact, it says they're going to talk about the Chicano movement. They're going to talk about women's suffrage, equal rights, the Snyder Act, the American labor movement. They're going to it lays out pretty clearly what the curriculum is.
So then, just to be clear here, then to ask you this, we're talking about. Oh, I see the problem. Okay, I'm so sorry about that, Doobie. We're actually talking about Senate Bill 3. I'm sorry about that, friend. I'll put it in chat. This is what was signed. I'm so sorry about that.
I put it in a chat. Or
So one of the weird things that that I found while I was like looking through this, right, is the like right near the, let me see, where is it? Page 5? Yeah, page 5. I just think it's really interesting to note that like people will the in this sort of like CRT hysteria, these laws are being passed that sort of like vindicate that by saying things like, so section 6 and section 7, an individual by virtue of the individual's race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex, something you can't teach obviously. An individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of the individual's race or sex. And these seem very purposely put in there to reinforce the idea that children are being taught to feel guilty for the color of their skin, basically.
And just to clarify, Senate Bill 3 is what's signed into law. House Bill 3979 was what introduced in the House, was had that language around the Klan. When it came to Senate Bill 3, it was removed, which, as Rage Comment posted in the VC chat, you can look at the introduced version versus the engrossed version.
Okay, now I'm even no, it's okay.
For that mix-up.
But now I'm even more confused because when I was speaking earlier about the language in the bill that talked about compelled and how teachers couldn't be compelled to do this, and the suggestions, the directives that the bill was giving them for if they chose to talk about current events, this is how they should do it. All of that was in the version of that I was reading earlier, the one that you posted here in chat, but it's not in this new thing that you sent me.
Right.
So were we talking about two different bills entirely?
No,
Senate Bill 3 is different than the House bill that was introduced earlier. So Senate Bill 3 is a totally separate bill, and that's the bill that's signed into law. I definitely did represent that was House Bill 3779. That is not the case. It is Senate Bill 3.
Is the Senate bill? Yeah, I was gonna ask.
I was gonna say they still have the line because I was reading word for word, even though I was on a different page, talking about the current events part. It's on. Let me see the section.
You know, one thing I'm very surprised is that in
Or you can
the
just
whole
control search.
Yeah, I'm looking for it. I'll find it.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I'm surprised in our whole entire list on the stuff to like teach to the kids in the Texas bills that they didn't even put the Provenir massacre of 1918. That's like huge in Texas history.
The what?
The Provenir massacre of 1916. Like literally, like a bunch of Texas Rangers did a pogrom against Mexicans.
A pogrom.
Yeah, pogrom. It was,
Provenir massacre.
and a lot of it was sanctioned by the governor. It's like very much similar to how like the Tulsa riot, Tulsa massacre, stuff like that, but that's in Texas.
And that was just added in 2020.
Does the bill that is law contain the line where I can't teach that slavery was actually our forefathers or actually American values?
Slavery doesn't seem to appear in the bill at all from a control search.
but it does limit what you can. No, it does because it says it was a deviation. Let me control search.
I'm very.
The deviation line. There's a couple of versions. I'm not sure which one is the most.
The version that I'm looking at.
Hold on, but Joe, the thing you posted is about like weather emergencies.
Yeah, no,
So I
the
don't
one
know.
it's the one above. Rage comment.
Yeah, Rage comment posted.
Right
Sorry
one.
about that. That's the one I'm also looking at, by the way.
Joe,
Okay.
I'll
The one
delete
that-
out utilities.
Sorry about
Texas Senate Bill 3, the one that was actually passed, does not mention slavery. I don't think at all.
Slavery doesn't appear on the bill, neither does the Ku Klux Klan.
But it does though.
Not on the one that was passed. Only the one.
The one that I posted, it literally says, with respect to their relationship to American values, slavery and racism are, well, this is part of a thing, but it has that in there. If you go to the page that I have,
Go to engrossed.
Go to the status. If you see the status in that specific one, it'll say engrossed, reported engrossed, and a different link that I'm pretty sure Joe linked. It says passed, and those are the difference between the two links and bills.
Passed.
To clarify, this is the one. It's not the utilities one.
Wait, what is
relating to
sorry,
certain curriculum in public schools, including certain instructional requirements and prohibitions, reported engrossed. So this is what was signed into law.
Okay,
engrossed
so this
is
does
the final
contain.
one, right?
Gross doesn't. So it still has the advent of slavery part. That's a correction there. And then the one about the Klan no longer exists.
Yeah, the part of the Klan, because I searched Ku Klux Klan and it wasn't there in my web browser, and then I searched for slavery and it goes to the section.
Okay. So audience, I guess we've been trying to figure out exactly which version of the bill actually got passed into law, right? It was signed by Greg Abbott, or will be signed.
It's already it's in place.
Okay, so it was signed. Okay,
it's signed.
Okay,
Yes.
Great. Only not great. Okay, so yeah, sorry, we were just spending a little time trying to figure this out. So
and this is a report from the for what it's worth, it's NBC News covering it. I'll find another one for those of you who are.
I mean, I kind of side with Doobie in that a lot of what's in this bill is being played as like a lot worse than it actually is. But I do understand the concern that like the chilling effect that people are talking about, in that there are teachers who, well, they're not legal scholars, and they probably won't even read. I mean, some people read the bill, but it might be passed down through the board as, oh, just don't talk about this stuff. And like, they may have the ability to in the legal system to talk about things, but people get scared, and not every teacher wants to take that risk, and so that can be a concern.
But that seems like it. I mean, given this is Texas, that seems like it might even be a good thing. I mean, do you really want a Texas teacher, right, talking to his middle school, high school kids about like a UBI, right, and telling them how communist it is or some shit, right, without presenting the other side, right? This is laying out that they need to lay out the other side.
I mean, Texas isn't just a super. I mean, it's a red state, but it's actually, it's a purple state. I'm not
It's
even
a
saying
blue
it's a red
state, motherfuckers. It's a blue state. The fucking
so I'm not going to
Republicans
say that
suppressed the votes of an entire county.
I'm not going to say by default, oh, it's going to be like the Republican teachers or something. So like, I don't think that argument.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's just it's as likely to happen, probably more likely to happen than the other side, right? That's some lefty or whatever that doesn't talk about UBI or student loan forgiveness, right? Because all those policies could be presented by someone with a right wing bent, right? Someone who's biased. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
my
could
point
use this to make sure that people aren't just giving the right wing side as well. You could use it that way.
The issue that I have here again, and I made it clear, and I'll put a map in chat, is that currently 30 states are introducing this, and an overwhelming majority are state legislatures that are Republican leaning, some of which are supermajorities. And the states that ban it outright are Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, South Dakota, West Virginia, and then certain states did what I think should be done, which is done at the school board level. The school board.
What is this ass hat map? What the fuck? Why do that this way?
It's a bad map. I'm gonna give you like credence. It's a bad map.
Yeah.
And then what's great about this is that it shows the bills, every single bill that's currently being introduced and debated on currently, and it also shows the links to them as well.
Yeah. So
and
I mean,
is it this? Those points that mentioned about like race it, like you can't teach on the account of your, like, say things are inherently or superior than other races. All of those bullet points exist in some variation in a vast majority of those bills.
I mean, those bullet points in and of themselves aren't bad bullet points.
Right, they're not. Right, but again, like my point is, if the rhetoric is targeting critical race theory, and we understand that it's actually just a geist to target inclusivity, diversity, and equity education, this is just the stepping stone, and even some legislatures even admit that it's a stepping stone. Like, it's just like the first piece of legislation to lead to other things, whether it be restrictions for
which
gender.
part of critical race theory goes against that?
Yeah, I really don't see a problem with this. Like, I haven't read through the entire new thing you posted, right? So, but I've looked at the slavery portion, because you're right. It doesn't say that it, the ways in which that they should teach the ways in which slavery was morally wrong, but it does say that they should teach that slavery and racism are deviations and betrayals and failures to live up to the founding principles. Right now, you could disagree with that, right? But it lays out that they are, which include liberty and equality. So it seems here that they're still teaching that these are bad things, right? That were betrayals and failures of the country.
Again,
I don't
Doobie, the
know if that's a
issue
problem.
isn't what's going. And I mentioned this earlier. I don't know if you were here for this. It's not about what's on the page ink-wise. Yes, there is the chilling effect argument, but again, rhetorically, they're using critical race theory to challenge whiteness, racial equity, racial equality, inclusivity, diversity, any type of equity education, and it's just a perpetuation of this rhetoric when they're creating these bills. So that's the issue that I have here. Like, if you want to go after critical race theory that you think is being taught in schools, then bring forth evidence. But they're passing these things using critical race theory as their evidence in order to justify the passing of those.
Yeah, I understand that, but if this is what they're passing, I really don't see any issues with this.
I do.
Well, tell me, like, what's the worst thing here? Maybe lay out like your biggest.
Sure.
Here.
So one of the arguments.
Wait, one second. So just not the chilling effects. I really think that's a really bad argument. But like something that's in the bill that you think is just demonstrably like bad.
No, I'm not arguing the bills here, dude. Like,
we're talking about the bills.
The bills are one part.
The idea of meritocracy not being structurally racist, like that would be one. The idea that we live in a meritocracy, people who are where they are there because of their own merit and not because of systemic injustice. I think that's kind of shitty to like say that you can't teach people.
Meritocracy is based off the fact that you can propel yourself upwards based off your own ability.
Okay,
So here's what I'm talking. I'm gonna just like
we don't
show my
live in
hand a little bit.
Meritocracy, though.
I'm gonna post this in chat. This is a parent advocacy group called Parents Against Critical Theory. This is one of the larger advocacy groups against critical race theory in Loudoun County, Virginia. They already in a couple weeks, I'm going down there to see their educational training that James Lindsay is running. I'm also going to Sarasota to see Chris Rufo in like late August. And what they're arguing here, and I'll just read from here, is that CRT has infected academia, entertainment, government, schools, finance and law, sports, and corporations. Underneath the CRT umbrella, there are many different types of Trojan horses disguised as CRT. Diversity, inclusion, culturally responsive instruction, framework, ethnic studies, and of course, equity. And then it goes on with a bunch of different types of things. And this is also a group that organized a campaign, like a Vote for Glenn Youngkin campaign, who is the governor, who is the individual who's running on the Republican ticket for the gubernatorial seat in Virginia. And that's one of the only 2 seats that are being run. And something that I'm kind of sniffing is that they're using critical race theory and these bills and all this stuff to change the conversation around the culture war to win back seats in, whether it be at the legislative level all the way up to Congress seats and stuff like that. And that's my argument on that.
Yeah, I mean,
I
got there.
Yeah, also to add that much of these Republican states already even have courses that specifically teach the lost cause myth in many of their history courses.
What's that?
The lost cause myth is basically the explaining like the rehabilitation of the Confederacy being waged due to states' rights, which is entirely miscontextual to really it's about slavery, and yes, they're racist. It takes an emphasis on not putting slavery forward as the main point of the Civil War and makes it more about like, well, these people are wanting to do it for their rights, and there are other lost cause mythologies.
Yeah,
a lot of other
right
things
here. It says the lost cause of the Confederacy is a ideology that advocates the belief that the cause of the Confederate States during the American Civil War was heroic, just, and not centered
Yeah.
on slavery. And that's
Yeah.
heavily teached in southern states, and anecdotally,
Yeah,
it
and
is.
it's really bad. Like it's
like in
Okay, but that's not the result of this bill or
It's not
any
the
of
re-
these bills.
okay, we're
This is something that's been happening
okay,
for.
well, can I finish?
You may, sir.
I want it just quick. Even if these are not the result of this bill, it's already in place that even if they don't have to put the language that specifically talks about it being as a measure to their studies, it's still there and it's still happening.
Right. So, I'm going to get to what Vivian said. 'Cause I actually thought that was really interesting. The meritocracy thing. So it does say, yeah. So it does say that fuck, I lost it. God, I blame you, Dan. Okay, a second. Okay. So I found it. So it does say that a teacher, administrator, or other employee of a state agency, school district, or open enrollment charter school may not require or make part of a course inculcation in the concept that, and then skipping down to the meritocracy thing. It says meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. I really don't see an issue with that, because all they're saying is that you can't make that idea part of the curriculum, a required part of the curriculum. Right? So like,
okay, you see exactly how that can be interpreted though, right?
Well, I don't think that's something that should be taught anyway. That seems really silly to teach that meritocracy and hard work ethic, or something that like invented to oppress another race. That seems really silly.
Well, the idea that we live in a meritocracy has very much been used in that fashion. What are you talking about?
Well, I think that I think I'd understand what you're saying if this was like not presented along with them teaching about systemic slavery across the board in this bill, right? So they're teaching about civil rights, they're teaching about the KKK, about white supremacy, about like the consequences
the
of slavery.
KKK aren't actually mentioned in here, right? Like,
I don't think it's silly to propose that meritocracy is an idea that's used to keep people in power.
As an example,
I think that's a really reasonable viewpoint.
Another thing to mention, which matters here, is that Eugene Del Goyado is a former representative in Virginia. He is part of this group, I think it's called Proud Advocate USA, and he uses these arguments in his rhetoric to advocate against gender affirmation and stuff like that. As example, he deemed, I think it was July, as LMNOP Day. LMNOP plus month, excuse me. And it was a whole
alphabet
fucking thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I put it in chat. It's like the issue I still have here is that rhetorically, as Viv's laying out here, is that it doesn't like they're using these things in these bills to start targeting other things. So they're going to use the meritocracy thing to start dramming around the gender identity discussion about gender affirmation in terms of pronouns, which they've already done in Virginia and other states.
What does that have to do with meritocracy?
How does meritocracy get to gender pronouns?
They argue that meritocracy, the idea that they perpetuate is that these trans individuals and these folks are saying that meritocracy is sexist, and then we have to push back against that ideology because it's just another example of cultural Marxism, which then is why we're also against critical race theory. It's just this circular argument that continues to...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it could frame sexism as well, but yeah.
For sure.
Here's the point. Here's the thing that disturbs me about... Okay, fine, go ahead. Go on.
I was just maybe we're at an impasse here because we just have totally different understandings of what meritocracy is. Right? Maybe that's it. 'Cause I don't think that the saying someone has a hard work ethic is like a racist thing,
that's
right? Or that the concept of meritocracy or hard work ethic itself is like racist or sexist.
Okay,
or was created by.
I think you're clearly taking a very bad faith argument here.
How is that bad faith?
Very clearly.
Oh, okay.
Very clearly, I stated not that the concept of meritocracy or the concept of a hard work ethic, right, is inherently racist, but that the concept that we are living in a meritocracy has been used in a racist fashion in order to say that the people who are where they are there purely because of merit, right?
Okay, but you're talking about something else.
Hard enough workers, and therefore they are rightfully at the bottom of the economic food chain.